We are in session, work session, both Arlington County Boards, the Arlington County Board and the school board. Welcome, colleagues, Chair Kadira, Vice Chair Seher Sutton, Ms. Tapia Hadley, Ms. Clark, and Ms. Turner. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate that you come here. We had the amazing honor to actually use your board room to meet a couple of times last year when we were here in renovations. So we really appreciated the vibe and the feeling of being in your shoes, in your chairs for a while. I have to say it was really a good thing too. And we should, I think for the future, think about having a reciprocity agreement here that we go on both sides. We consider you always our colleagues, but this comes with an addition. We really consider you, and I think that people in our constituents consider us as partners. Partnership is always way more than just collaboration. It's actually leaning in and trying to figure out solutions to common problems. And the best part of that is that when partnership works, the solution and the benefits and the dividends of these solutions accrue to everybody. And that's, I believe, the spirit of today's work session. So we're welcoming all my colleagues on our side of the county board, Mr. Spain, Ms. Cunningham, Vice Chair DeFerranti, and Ms. Coffey. And I will just throw this over to you, Chair Kadira, for initial remarks. Just let me give you mine. Now it works.
Working now? Oh, good.
Yeah,
okay, just want to be sure.
As an addendum to what I said, you have better microphones in your boardroom.
Thank you very much, Chair Karantonis, and thank you all for inviting us to join you today for this joint work session. We on the school side of the House have been on quite a journey, and it started last summer with our budget work. Our journey has been somewhat different this year than in previous years for reasons that you are already aware of. We have worked hard to try to bring you along since last summer through one-on-one meetings, through our joint leadership meetings that occur every month, and through 2x2s. And through those conversations, we have been very grateful for your interest in our work and your partnership. So those progress reports that I just described have given you all the general arc of the story of our budget and its development, but I recognize that much of the detail is fresh today. In previous years, there have usually been multiple weeks between the presentation of the superintendent's proposed budget and the work session where we convene together. This year, it has been less than 24 hours. We have needed the few extra weeks this year in order to do our careful study and our deliberation. Both the internal analysis that has been conducted by our finance team, which is capably led by our Assistant Superintendent, Andy Hawkins, who's here with us today, and the work that we commissioned from an external independent firm that has done similar budget analysis with other school divisions. So, because we needed that extra time and because this is hot off the press for you all, we understand you may have more questions for us than usual today, which we are more than happy to answer, both in this session and in the weeks ahead before we approve our budget on May 1st. So with that preamble, if we could pull up some slides, Dr. Duran and I will be jointly presenting this proposed budget today, and so we're going to tag team and walk you through some information.
Just for a second before you go, welcoming our both administrative leaders of both systems, Dr. Duran and Mr. Swartz. I also wanted to, just for the public and for the record, we are going to start with a presentation of the school budget, which we will be, Chair Kadira and Dr. Duran, you will be sharing the presentation. I anticipate about 45 minutes for that, and then we will have wholesome conversation about an hour and a half. Then we will have a concise, abbreviated county presentation of where we are with our budget process right now, followed by discussion. And that is basically the program so that everybody knows how to navigate the session as we go. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. If we could bring up the slides from APS. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues on the county board and county manager. Our presentation that we'll share with you today outlines our proposed FY 2026 budget, which has a focus on maintaining and sustaining our core services to support our priorities. And those priorities, as outlined in our strategic plan, are student academic growth and success, student well-being, student-centered workforce, operational excellence, and student, family, and community partnerships. We also want to provide an overview of the significant budgetary challenges we faced in the current landscape as we strive annually to do more with less funding. We'll share the reductions that have been proposed to help close our budget gap this year and a wide range of needs that are not funded in this budget, but which remain high priorities for us, our students, staff, and schools. We've made a commitment to our staff to ensure that they receive a compensation increase next year and that our compensation remains competitive. Today, we'll highlight the proposed investment and how we're continuing to prioritize compensation and invest in our employees. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the superintendent and his cabinet, the executive leadership team, our principals and staff for their support in creating this budget and working collaboratively. We want to also thank you, the county board and county manager, for your ongoing partnership and the support that you provide, both financial, strategic, and moral, to meet the needs of our growing school division. We can go to the next slide. So we began the FY 2026 budget with a forecasted $41.4 million deficit. The school board and APS leadership have used the extended budget process since July to review every aspect of our operating budget. And we've been asking ourselves questions like, how are we going to address this deficit, not just this year, but manage it in future years and hopefully decrease it? What are our true needs? How does APS compare to its peers? And are there areas within our existing budget which could be reduced and still meet the needs of our diverse student body? As we did this work, we had several important considerations. First, the school board is aware that every study that has been conducted in the area of education research has concluded that good instructional learning is not dependent on what laptop is provided to students, what smartboard is in their classroom, or what textbook they carry in their backpack, but rather the best asset in every school are highly qualified and properly compensated staff. To that end, we began our process last summer by building in staff compensation at the forefront, and we wanted to afford more work-life balance through increased parental leave. These are requests that are seconded by our colleagues in our bargaining unit, some of whom are with us today in the collective bargaining process, and we've appreciated their partnership as well. This effort has resulted in a higher compensation increase in this proposed budget than in last year's budget, and we did that without increasing class size. Second, the school board's direction was to give preference to preserving student-facing resources and roles that are aligned with our priorities and strategies for student academic growth. And importantly, those include the implementation of the first phase of staffing changes that were recommended in a planning factor study done in 2024. Planning factors, as you all know, are the formulas by which we allocate staff for certain roles and purposes in our school division. Implementing phase one will help us address some of our staffing needs in English language learner instruction and for special education students. Third, the school board's direction was to identify opportunities for cost savings via targeted and strategic realignment of funds rather than across-the-board percentage cuts to departments and schools whenever possible. We also asked that there be a rationale included for any requested increases above last year's baseline, and that rationale should describe expected impacts and identify by whom those impacts will be measured and when. Finally, we directed that the budget should minimize the use of general reserve funds for operating expenses, and consistent with the principle that one-time funds should be used only for one-time costs. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the presentation. I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Dr. Duran.
Thank you. As you'll see in this year's fiscal year 26 budget, our total is $845.4 million, which is an increase from last year of 2.31%. The next few slides will give you an overview of some of the highlights of our budget. So as we move forward, the next slide and to the next slide, you can see that we have grouped our investments by performance objectives as outlined in our school board's adopted 2024-2030 strategic plan. I'm going to begin this afternoon by sharing with you our areas of focus and investment in student-centered workforce, because as mentioned earlier by Chair Cadera, this was a goal of all six of us, to build a budget with staff compensation at the forefront, and also working with our union partners and beginning to think about how we could address some of the requests that they have been bringing forth in collective bargaining. Next slide, please. Retaining and recruiting our high-quality staff is the foundation of all that we do to serve our students and community. And this budget does invest in compensation increases for all of our employees. It does not meet all of the requests from our collective bargaining, and it does not meet our own desire to increase our compensation at even higher levels, which we would love to do. But you'll see through today's presentation and through our conversation that we do have challenges to close our gap. All of this is part of also an effort to remain market competitive and sustainable. We currently are, for most scales, in the top 3 of our surrounding jurisdictions and school systems. We don't know in this new budget what we will look like in that same way, because all of our surrounding schools divisions are currently proposing budgets, and they have a variety of COLA increases and requests to their localities, whether it's their city council or their board of supervisors, respective county governments. But what we've done to do here is to attempt to maintain that competitiveness. So you'll see we've invested $23.73 million in compensation adjustments. This includes a step increase for all of our eligible employees, which costs $11.49 million, and a 2% cost of living adjustment at a cost of $12.24 million. Every budget is really challenging, and we would again like to reiterate that we want to do more in this area, and we are going to continue to make sure that this is annually something we revisit, because we must remain competitive in our region. And that's not just to be competitive. We must also make sure we're investing to retain our staff, who are why APS is the best place to serve students in this area. I also want to note that in the General Assembly's adopted budget, they have outlined dollars for a 3% overall cost of increase, and we have 4.26%. So our proposal is slightly higher than what's in the General Assembly budget. I do also want to note, and many of you do know this on the county board, we've discussed this, that when the General Assembly provides us dollars for compensation, we don't get dollar for dollar. In fact, every dollar that is received from the state towards compensation, APS must put in $2 extra to actually reach the prescribed compensation increase that's outlined. Next slide. As I mentioned a few moments ago, retention of our staff is a really important area of ours, not just remaining competitive. This slide outlines that over the past 5 years, thanks to the partnership with our county government and thanks to the leadership of our school board, that we've been continuing to invest in compensation. And we've seen over the past 5 years, the rate of retention rising by 5% from when it had a dip after the pandemic ended. So you can see we're now back up to 89% retention rate, which is similar to right before the pandemic. Next slide. I also want to highlight that in the last 5 years, because this is such an important part of the work we do, I do believe that your budget speaks to your values, and our budget is primarily focused on employees. That is the bulk of our budget. So as we think about that, we have to start with compensation as a priority. And in the last 5 years, we have provided an average compensation increase of 25.71%, which has helped us to remain competitive, but again, not fully what we would like to do. On average, in fact, over the last 5 years, there's been about a 5.14% increase. And that, I believe, is in direct correlation to our increasing retention rate. Prior to the pandemic, the 5 years prior, the average compensation increase was only 2.78%. And at that time, we fell below. And when our compensation study was done a few years ago, we were not in the top 3. In some cases, we were actually number 8 and number 9. So we must all at this table remain committed to reinvesting in our staff compensation, each year coming together with that being a goal of what we can do more for our staff, how we can provide better opportunities to engage in collective bargaining and to provide the compensation that's needed for our employees. The next slide, I'll shift to a second area in our strategic plan, which is student academic growth and success. Some highlights here in terms of our additional funding. This year, we limited the funding increases and new additions to the budget to compensation and to a few things I will highlight here. Each and every year, we must look at our enrollment projections. While we're not seeing large enrollment increases in our system like we did in years past, we do have a slight enrollment increase projection for next year. And we do look at demographic changes like the prediction of students with disabilities and our English learners that need to be served. The combination of the enrollment projection and the demographic changes that are projected for next year require us to add 23.3 new teaching positions for about $5.5 million. Also, we're very proud that we finally are able to start and chip away at the planning factor study. If you look at the study, you will see it is millions of dollars to implement in 1 year. We're not able to do that this year, but we are able to begin with phasing in of additional teachers for our English learner students and our students with disabilities. And in fact, 29.6 new teaching positions that will support our English learners and 19.5 new teaching positions to support our special education students. This is an increase of $2.29 million because, as the planning factor study showed, there are opportunities for us to use some of our assistants that were either supporting English learners or students with disabilities and convert some of those positions using that dollar, applying it towards teaching positions, which is why the $2.29 million is not the actual cost for those total number of 29.6 and 19.5. We are using some of the funding that would have been used for the assistance. In addition, we are making sure that we provide for instructional resources and supports. We have additional things like our 2 dual language immersion teachers and 4 technicians. As we move forward in our 2 dual language immersion elementary schools, we are continuing our progression of, we began a few years ago at the kindergarten, we're shifting to 80%, 20% model. Next year, we're moving at the 3rd grade to 70 to 30%, which warrants 2 additional positions. Also included in this area are inflationary costs with instructional materials, testing materials, technology repair, and anticipated tuition increases for Thomas Jefferson High School Science and Technology. And you'll see also we've put some efficiencies in that area. So the investments totally in this area for student academic growth and success is $11.5 million new dollars. You see the bulk of it, the 5.5 and the 2.9, is related to additional staffing. On the next slide, you will see that there are some efficiencies that we had to put in place and adjustments that we had to consider given the $41.1 million gap and our focus being, again, on compensation. So here are the areas of proposed adjustments in this category. The first would be a reduction of some exemplary project teaching positions, 11.25, for a reduction of $1.6 million. Reducing general education library aides to half-time, $1 million, and that's 17.5 positions. Working with our integration station students and reducing the projected cost of tuition, not reducing any of the positions there, but reducing the tuition costs to find a way to support those students. We are still having conversations with that community and with the children's school, which is a partner there, to see the path forward. But at this time, the proposal is to reduce the cost for the tuition fully and find a way to support those students. Our 4th area of reduction and adjustment in this category is reducing our ITC contracts from 12 months to 11 months, and that's a savings of about $400,000, and in alignment with the study that was done, many surrounding jurisdictions have a similar contract. And finally, capping the amount of advanced placement tests that we pay for. Currently, we pay for all advanced placement tests that students take. We would cap it to 3 unless you're a student whose family has free or reduced needs, then they would receive all paid for. And also capping the number of slots that we pay for at Thomas Jefferson High School of Technology to 105 students, which is about the current number we have of not having more. The next slide is the next category from our strategic plan, thinking about student well-being. We have to always make sure we're focusing and increasing safety for our students and staff. And so one key investment next year are some school safety personnel in the amount of 6 new positions. These are our SSCs, we call them, and these are individuals who work in our schools to support safety. These 6 new positions will be 3 allocated to elementary schools. We currently have SSCs in our middle and high schools. We do not have any dedicated to elementary. This will allow us to have 3 dedicated to our elementary, and the additional 3 positions at our aquatic centers. Another area of concern that we've seen in the area of student well-being is making sure we have the appropriate medical personnel on hand for our athletic events, and this provides additional staffing for athletic training staff for that purpose. And just like in our other category, we had to make some baseline inflationary adjustments around $500,000 for supplies and things of that nature as related to student well-being. The next slide will talk about another category of operational excellence. Maintaining operational efficiency in this area is an additional investment of $2.71 million. Breaking that down, one key part is recruitment of bilingual staff. Incorporated in our budget is a $190,000 contract to hire a firm that will assist us in recruiting and transitioning international bilingual teachers to become dual language immersion teachers in our schools. This vendor will assist us by not only recruiting, but importantly, helping with housing and transportation needs as those individuals come to support our students in those programs. Another important addition, as we've worked with our bus drivers, is looking at the contract and having conversations with them about the contract needs of their current situation, where they currently work 11 months and 6 hours. This budget will change that to a 10-month, 7-hour contract, which is in alignment with our surrounding peer divisions, which we believe will help us in recruitment and retention. This does require us to add $440,000 to the budget for that purpose. However, we do anticipate this will save overtime costs, and it will save costs of not losing staff who can go work in another division. And when we lose staff and have vacancies, there's a different type of cost in terms of being able to get students to and from school safely and on time. There were also some dollars allocated for positions that from year to year, once the budget is adopted until the following budget, there may be at times positions that are reclassified from what was initially adopted in the budget, and we have 15 of those that occurred over the last year. Things like special education coordinators that were needed, and we took resource teacher positions to reclassify them. It's a higher grade. There was a need for specialists in some cases and some different aides and professional staff at our outdoor lab as we reclassified those positions. Also, like I mentioned in other areas, this has inflationary costs for supplies, equipment, repair, and our maintenance of our facilities and buildings, and also the rising costs that we are projected to see with our leases, waste management, and utilities. In this area, though, we are using one-time funds, actual reserves. You'll hear later from Ms. Cadera how we have really taken a different approach to reserves, but in this category, we have identified things that are truly one-time and use reserves only for those. And this is things like replacement of our network infrastructure equipment, access points, switches, servers, things of that nature, our school bus replacement cycle, and we were able to restore $1.5 million from our MCMM, which allows us to have dollars towards maintenance and facilities projects that are needed, and provide an additional $1.8 million from our capital reserve to replace 4 needed elevators throughout our division in schools. The next slide now I'll outline, just like I did in the previous categories, what were some adjustments that we're proposing and how are we closing the gap by making some changes and reductions. Through the consultation that we had with an outside firm, one area they identified for us as a potential area of savings was something called optimization of student-teacher ratios. This is looking at our current school staffing and our current enrollment at schools to determine, are there positions in schools that if they were not allocated this year, would not raise the class size above the maximum. The Baker-Tilly report identified a large number that they believed were in place. After reviewing that, and we're continuing to review that, we do see that there are some nuances that they may not have been aware of at our secondary schools. And so the current proposal is for a $5.5 million reduction, or 56 positions, which is much lower, about 30% lower than they had projected of about $8 million. We're going to continue to work on this, but again, essentially, this is not raising the class size above the class maximum. It is optimizing so that we have positions at all of our schools that are within or below that. We also had to take a hard look because, as Ms. Cadera talked about, there was the desire for us to focus on not touching student-facing positions as much as possible. So we began that look at our central office positions. And in our proposal this year is the elimination of 27.5 central office positions from our operating budget. 4 of which will remain but be in our grant funding. And this is a total reduction of about $5 million related to those positions. Reductions took place as we analyzed each and every level, so it started at all levels in our central office. In fact, I'll share some more of that in our summary coming up. We also looked at our extended day program and recognized that the fees paid for these services by parents were sufficient to cover related operating expenses. So moving forward, we're going to shift the revenue and the operational costs for that into a self-sustaining unit and no longer contribute operating dollars. I want to be very clear when people read this on the slide and if you have community members asking you about this, we're not eliminating extended day. It is simply moving it to self-sustaining. And in fact, we are working on ways on how we can expand our extended day. We currently have about 335 students on the wait list, finding ways to reduce that. We also are looking and working, Mr. Hawkins is working on a plan with his team to see how we can operate extended day even during spring break, some of our selected holidays, and during the summer. So again, I want to say one more time, I want to stress, we're not proposing eliminating the extended day program. It's actually recognizing it as a self-sustaining, non-operating budget program. All expenses, again, being paid through the fees received. We also, in this area, and the county board has worked very closely with us, thank County Manager Schwartz and his team who've provided us guidance on this as we work to partner with what to do on the other post-employment benefits trust fund and reducing our annual contribution by $1.6 million. As everyone on the county board knows, but for the public, this was established in 2010 to reimburse retiree health insurance costs. And actuarial studies of this trust that have been done in partnership with some of the individuals that the county manager recommended us to work with have concluded that we'll be able to sustain the trust of a foreseeable future, even with this reduced annual contribution. But knowing that this is an important trust to maintain, the school board will be reassessing the health of the trust annually going forward to ensure that we are not putting ourselves in a dire situation there. But we do not believe we are in the foreseeable future, given the actuarial studies that were done. Another area of reduction in this area is reducing the amount of additional days that are provided to our central office departments and schools for staff that are not 12-month to work during the summer or non-contract time, reducing that amount in half, which is about a $350,000 reduction, and looking at reducing central office contracts by $320,000 and reevaluating the instructional apps and softwares we use to see where reductions can be made on those. Now I'd like to summarize our reductions in a different way on the next few slides. I just finished showing you each of our strategic plan categories, and now let me talk about how those reductions apply to central office overall and to our schools separately. We have a total amount of reductions of $22.36 million. Looking at our central office reductions, as we work through the budget challenges, making difficult decisions, understanding that staffing is important at all levels of the division, but we want to prioritize the staffing as close to our schools and our students first. And in doing so, we are proposing, as I mentioned a few moments ago, reducing the central office positions by 27.5, which is about 2.5% of our central office workforce. This reduction is in combination with last year. We proposed and actually adopted the reduction of 21 positions. So last year and this year, that is a total of 48.5 central office positions that will have been reduced for $31 million reduction in 2 years. And our central office reductions span, as I mentioned a few moments ago, many different departments and many different scales, beginning at the highest at the executive cabinet level with the reduction of the chief operating officer position. There are also 8 executive director or director level positions within our academics, school support, and operation departments, which are being eliminated or moved to partial grant funding. Other positions in our central office included in the 27.5 are specialists, analysts, clerical, and secretarial positions. In addition, beyond the positions I've already discussed, the extended day becoming self-sufficient, that removes $3 million from the central office operating fund. I mentioned already the employment post-benefit trust fund reduction, that reduces central office expenditures by 1.6. And I talked previously about the changes to our contract reduction and how we're moving our MCMM operating to be from our reserves. The next slide looks at the other reductions that aren't connected to central office, but that are connected to our schools. And this is about $9.7 million, or 84.75 positions, 0.8% of the workforce out in our schools, primarily in the category of the optimization of our student-teacher ratio. That's 56 of those 84. The exemplary projects, which I mentioned earlier, which is 11.25 of that, and the general education library aids in half, 17.5. Those three numbers add up to the 84.75. And then you'll see the other items here on this list that I've already discussed that are directly connected to schools: the integration station, ITC contracts, advanced placement tests, slots at Thomas Jefferson, and then our software. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit, though, about, while this is a very difficult budget year, the school board and I are very proud that we're able to continue our investment in compensation and do some positive investment in the regards to the planning factor work, but we have a lot more work to do, and there's a lot of unfunded needs. The next slide, I want to outline a few of those unfunded needs so that our community is very clear that there are some clear things that we would have done. First of all, we would not have made the many cuts that we had to make in all that I just described. We would also, though, want to make sure we're investing in the needs of our school system. And I want to remind our community, or introduce to those who may not be aware, that a recent study done at the state level called the JLARC study outlined and identified how underfunded school divisions are in the Commonwealth. And in fact, it was noted that APS, if we were funded properly through the JLARC study analysis, would be receiving an additional $51 million from the state. So on this slide, we outlined what would that $51 million look like in our proposal. We would certainly reduce class sizes. We would certainly provide more support in the area of interventionists for math and literacy and English learners. We would continue to expand the work we've been doing out of a pilot by providing deans at our remaining secondary schools. We would also further the planning factor study implementation and provide additional staff for English learners, students with disabilities, our counselors, psychologists, and social worker ratios. We would certainly do that. We would also provide an increase for the amount of dollars that our teachers receive to provide supplies for them. That has not been changed for inflation since 2014. And we would also work more closely with our bargaining process to provide more cost of living, more opportunities to provide parental leave than what we currently have. And so I want to underscore that our desire to increase compensation above what the current landscape allows, the opportunity, the investments that we've done are positive, but they're not where we want to be. And that is because we do not have the proper funding coming to us from Richmond. So I want to take my last moment before I turn to Ms. Cadera to call on all of our community to join together with us in making that advocacy very clear at the state about what we all need to do. We cannot come together, the group of all of us sitting at this table, each and every year, and put our heads together and scratch our heads and think that we're going to solve the problems and the unfunded needs that we see on this slide unless things change at the state level. We're going to continue to have challenging budget times. We're going to make some decisions, which we've done, that are difficult. Ms. Cadera will outline something we did have in our control in APS, which was to how we use reserve dollars. You'll see a change in our budget process this year. But that alone won't meet the unfunded needs that we have. We have to have a better, more appropriate, more aligned revenue approach coming to school funding from our General Assembly and our governor. With that, I will turn it to you, Ms. Cadera, for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. I'm going to walk us through, next slide, please. Just want to talk a little bit about how we align the investments with our priorities at a higher level. This is a condensed version of what we presented last night because you are intimately aware of what share of our budget comes from the county versus the state, et cetera. So on Pi Day, we actually took out the pie chart, and I'm sorry about that. We're going to turn instead on the next slide. We're going to jump right into talking about how we use reserves. I've been here with you in joint work sessions for 4 years now, and in all 4 of those conversations, well, the previous 3, we've had conversations about how we use reserves, how the county approaches reserves, and wanting to make sure that we have a shared understanding about what we believe to be good financial stewardship. I am very pleased to say that for the first time in my time on the board and in recent memory, in this budget, except for our use of our compensation reserve, all other reserves are being used only for one-time expenditures in accordance with good financial practice. The compensation reserve is a little bit different because traditionally we've used this annually to support the enhancement of staff compensation in the following year. So taking salary lapse and turnover and immediately converting it to the next year's compensation increase. And this is practice that our surrounding school divisions use as well. Outside of that, there is no use of one-time funds for ongoing expenses. This principled use of reserves, along with implementing the expense reductions that Dr. Duran mentioned earlier, are all aimed at minimizing our structural deficit and getting us on a more stable and sustainable financial footing so that we do not have to have painful and challenging conversations in our school division year over year. Next slide, please. So, as we mentioned at the outset, our budget totals $845.4 million, which is an increase of 2.31% over FY25. As you all know, our revenue share from you increased 1.2% this year. Our state revenue, based on what we know right now, we believe will increase 9.1 million, or just under 8%. That is contingent on the governor's blessing of that budget, which will happen early next month, we hope. And providing a compensation increase and beginning to implement our planning factor work were the major drivers of the increase this year. Next slide. So a look ahead at the work that's still in front of us. We are not done with our budget process, and this outlines the calendar of work sessions, hearings, and other milestones to get us to our final approval of our budget on May 1st. We posted this presentation, the longer version that we shared last night, that's posted on our website. And when we posted that, we also posted an array of other materials that reflect the work that we've been doing since last July. An example of that would be the questions that board members have submitted in writing since last summer till now. There are 100 of those questions with very detailed responses that are posted on our website for the community's review. That is the tip of the iceberg in terms of questions that we have asked verbally and in other ways since last summer. I encouraged last night and encourage all of you to review the material and engage in this process. Moving forward, the work is not done because we know that through public scrutiny of our work, others will help us spot consideration and unforeseen impacts that may not have been immediately apparent to those of us sitting around this table. And we are hopeful that our community engagement period will help us course correct where necessary and ensure a better final result. We are grateful to everyone who along the way has shared their ideas, questions, and perspectives thus far. We know that this year's budget contains changes that have a very human impact on many of our employees, on our students, and our community members. So we want to continue to carry out this work as carefully as possible and with a great sense of responsibility to our community as stewards of this public institution and our public funds.
And our budget book is online now for all the full details. We'll make sure a link is sent to all of you for our public. It's online. And on Monday, we will deliver a budget book to all of you to have the binder. But right now it is a link, and we'll have to make sure that link is sent to you today. For all of our public who'd like to see the full details of the budget, it is online.
Well, thank you. I don't know if colleagues, school board colleagues want to add to any remarks, framing remarks for the conversation to follow. That's okay if not. Wait, so we can.
After last night.
It was a very interesting meeting last night. I have to congratulate you and everybody who came up, and we are listening too, right? So we heard the people who testified for quite a while, also with coordinated red collars, and we always take note of this. I have also to say that at the very beginning of our budget process, we had some people who came here in this room and talked also about the integration station in this case. But anyway, I want to open this round for questions to my colleagues. I see your light, Mrs. Payne, and the floor is yours.
Anything less would be uncivilized, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Well, thank you to our illustrious chair and vice chair and the superintendent for being with us today. I have a page full of questions, but I'm going to start here, and I think our chair just referenced it, the elephant in the room per se, integration station. Can we talk a little bit about, because there's been very robust engagement in the community. We at the county board have actually received a lot of those emails. It's been in the news. There's been a petition, I think, of over 2,000 people. Can you talk a little bit about what went into the planning? And I know it's still yet to be determined, perhaps, Mr. Superintendent and Madam Chair, but I want to get a sense of like, even the feasibility of it remaining in place, or what is this approach? I see a merge into neighborhood schools, but I think, again, there's a sentiment in the community that we want to try to keep it.
So yes, we currently are still having discussions with as I mentioned in my presentation, with the community, with the children's school. Our long-term goal and vision, and I say ours, the school board and myself, long-term goal and vision is what's the best approach to provide support for those students. Long-term, we want to make sure that we are providing that high-quality service to all individual needs of our students. And so we are working on what does that look like in the short term and in the long term. In this proposal, again, there is no elimination of any of the positions related to supporting the students. It is the tuition there at the children's school itself and how we would then provide support to those students in their schools, their neighborhood schools closest to their neighborhood, is the ongoing discussions we're having. Again, there's a short-term and a long-term discussion. And I'll defer more to Ms. Cadera and Ms. Clark if they'd like to add.
Sure. I'll just add to that to say, in the same way that you all do when you look at services that the county provides, and in lean budget years, you're looking to create efficiencies by looking at where there may be redundancy, right, in your operation. We're doing the same exercise across all of our grade levels, all of our programs, to look at where we may be serving the same population in multiple ways, and trying to understand if we were to streamline and not offer as many different programs, whether we would still be able to meet the level of care and attention that our student populations deserve. You all know that we offer multiple types of pre-K in Arlington Public Schools. And when we think about our students with disabilities, we actually have 8 different types of classrooms for special education students. The work that we're trying to do through this process is to understand whether the needs of the student population at Integration Station can be met in the other kinds of pre-K programs that also serve special education students. And there is a process of discernment we're going through where we're looking at all of the kinds of services that those students and their families get at Integration Station and trying to map those across to our other programs. And then where there are gaps, identify whether those are gaps we could fill or whether that creates an argument to maintain Integration Station for the foreseeable future. So that is still an active discussion that we are having in order to understand whether those students need to remain in place and are served through that program, or whether indeed we could take advantage of our other pre-K offerings and the extra capacity in many of our elementary schools to deliver those services in a more cost-efficient way. And I don't know whether, Ms. Clark, you want to say anything about this as well.
I think with respect to Integration Station, what's important to understand is when this program was created, there was no inclusion. There wasn't. We had segregated classrooms. We've changed that. It's not perfect. It doesn't meet every child, but it meets 80%, I would say, of the students that are there. We could find homes in other locations. And as one person on the board, but also as a parent of 2 kids with disabilities that have gone through these programs, and I was not at Integration Station, we offered a slot, but turned it down because we wanted our student to be able to have the opportunity to be with neighborhood kids that we knew were going to be around there. There is such power to having strong neighborhood pre-K programs where the children grow up through the school and you have your peers built around you. Jamestown is a great example of the 2-year-old program there. It's an indoor-outdoor preschool program. It is phenomenal. If I won the lottery, that's where I'd go volunteer my time because the energy there is amazing. No one is saying that Integration Station isn't a magical place. It served as the baseline for everything else the county is doing right now to drive school.
Yeah.
And as somebody who also had my students' needs not met and took some really drastic measures to ensure my student got what he needed, I understand that desire to make sure that this works. But the assumption that another classroom type that's never been tried isn't going to work for your child, it's really a disservice to those programs because I know a lot of those teachers and they are phenomenal. We do have a couple things that we have to work on and think through the logistics of. We have 8 preschool classroom types. We serve 842 students in pre-K. But 2 of the 8 programs that we offer are only offered at Integration Station, so we know that.
Yeah.
We are lacking peer models in the community pre-K program. We know that. And part of that is, this access. So barriers to access would be, in this case, the fact that it's a high cost of the sliding scale and for the general ed students to come in and be part of the program and serve as the typical developing peer, and after-school care. As a parent, if you're expected to show up to the federal government from 8 to 5, we don't offer childcare for our 2 and 3 and sometimes 4-year-olds. So there is a benefit to being an existing program where that's offered. Know that we offer it there. That doesn't exist at our other schools. So there is a tension point there between programs and an equity issue to some extent.
Yeah. So really, the superintendent, Madam Chair, and Ms. Clark, thank you for providing some perspective on what's going on. And again, Ms. Clark, I appreciate your unique ability to understand and navigate the needs, especially of our students with disabilities and need those type of educational services. It's about the right fit. It's about having the right therapy and putting them in the right space. And you bringing in that inclusive dynamic is ever so important. So how you articulate and share what's going on in this particular case will be well served. Again, because we're getting a lot of questions about it. I think lastly, Mr. Chair, just one more question. I'm sure we're going to have extended conversation. Just so I can be clear, Mr. Superintendent, what is the amount per pupil? Is it $31,000 per year that we're spending, or just to make sure I'm right here?
In this new projected, let me see.
It's 28.
Yeah, last year was 24, but 28.
28.
In this new projection.
$28,000 per pupil. And so I'll tell you some thoughts. Again, I'm not getting into the minutia of how you make the sausage and this budget. But when you look in large scale comparison across the nation and then to a region, we are spending a large amount of money on each pupil, right? And I think what I'm hearing in the community, just from the county board side, is how are we making sure we get a good bang for the buck? So as you look at this budget and where you cut, and you're bringing in new folks and cutting some FTEs and librarians and putting folks at the personal safety folks at the aquatic centers and things like that. I think in lower scale, the parent, and I've been a parent of 3 kids in APS, is about, are we getting the best bang for the buck? And I have some additional questions to lay out, but for context, I think folks who are watching this need to know we're spending a significant amount of money to educate our youth. In lower scale comparison based on data, if you look at other jurisdictions, not only locally, but across this nation. And I think we have an amazing education system, but there's still room for improvement and perhaps to be more innovative, right? Mr. Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Spain. I saw Vice Chair DeFrent in the news conference.
Ms. Eckerson would like to respond to that.
I'm sorry.
So thank you. I just wanted to mention very quickly that in the analysis done by our consultants this winter, they provided us with a different way of looking at the cost per pupil that we had not broken down before or in quite some time, in which they looked at the cost per pupil of our, for example, general education neighborhood elementary schools and our general high schools, and then also looked at the cost per pupil of some of our more specialized programs, such as the career technical and adult education classes that are offered at the Career Center, and some of the other sort of specialized, like we were just discussing, programs for students with disabilities. So there is, in fact, an unevenness. It is not that we spend the $28,000 on each student, every single student in the county. There is a distinction with some of the special populations that we serve and some of the programming that we do. And I will just say that we are known for having some of the best career technical education in the state. So there's trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that context, and I think regardless of the jurisdiction you go into, you're going to see everyone's looking at that dynamic, perhaps in a different way, right? Appreciate that. I'm just putting what does DOE look at, and what do others look at when they're reviewing Arlington, and what the larger audience is digesting when they say, okay, how much are we spending per pupil? They don't understand the nuances associated with the different levels of data analysis that you just discussed, and that's great to know at this point. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for Ms. Sutton of clarifying that. I remember early in school that averaging is not your friend. You should never average. You should never index on average. I would fail many exams if I indexed on average anything. But and this is an important part of our conversations. And I think we figured out that quality matters, and how to measure and how to build accountability from the qualitative point of view, not only from the quantitative point of view, is important, right? I used to joke saying, oh, APS, $840 million, 45 point something. So that's about the budget of a city. A city the size of Alexandria, not a small city. But there are reasons for that. There are deliverables for that. There are dividends for that. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of things if we wouldn't invest that. If I liked something in the presentation was the investment. Of course, we want to talk about the savings and the dividend from the investment. So anyway, I am taking the time from Vice Chair DeFerranti. Oh, yes.
One more follow-up, and thanks to my colleague here. I think it's, the two questions that Mr. Spain raised in connection with one another represent the tension, right, of we have integration station, and it has been for a long time the gold standard of inclusive pre-K education, early intervention. When you look across our system at cost per pupil of our different programs at schools, integration station is an outlier because it is the gold standard, and because it is full day, and because it has on-site built-in OT and PT and speech therapy, et cetera. We make choices in Arlington like that. We've made choices with our Arlington Community High School that we want to offer continuing education and the opportunity to get high school diplomas for older students, which is not the case in every community. We have students up to age 62 in Arlington Community High School. Our Shriver program, I went on a field trip with Shriver a couple weeks ago to the African American History and Culture Museum. That is an exemplar of the way that we educate those students for independent community living. All of those things, plus the other amenities that we hear about every time we do our budget, our planetarium, our outdoor lab, our option programs. You heard Dr. Duran talk about our immersion program, for example. Immersion doesn't have necessarily an exactly equivalent cost because we are hiring a firm to help us recruit international teachers. We are adding staff to implement an 80-20 model in our immersion schools because research tells us that that's going to be more effective for the success of our English learners. So all of those things combined, for us, we have made choices that have bumped up our cost per pupil. And as a community, we need to continue to have conversations about which ones of those we want to carry forward.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Kadira. Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to each of you. I did not yet watch last night, so my ability to read the room is somewhat limited in that sense. I will look in more detail, and I certainly know that, being in your position, people's children in some ways are more personal to them than their sewer bill.
Just a little bit.
Just being, or their tax rate. Sometimes more than their tax rate, which is very personal to everyone listening and very personal at this moment. But so despite not knowing exactly what happened last night, I'm going to just share my views. Big picture, this is a serious budget, and I'm super grateful for your work on it. That doesn't mean that I'm not upsetting lots of parents right now by saying that out loud, but this is a serious budget, and that's an accomplishment that I'm very grateful for. Helping the most kids with an emphasis on those kids who are most in need is what you guys have to weigh and determine. So I'm just very grateful in that sense. I'm sure we'll hear more. We are partners, and I will try and stay fully in my lane. Everybody in the room probably knows I started my career teaching at 100% free and reduced lunch schools. So I'm a particularly dangerous county board member, and then I have opinions that are not always easily within my lane. But I will never forget what I vowed then, which is if I had a chance, I would try and fight for the kids that I taught. And so I'm investing major in schools. I can live with that. That's what we should be doing. That is upstream justice. And so we should be doing that. The big picture things that are out there, optimizing, that's $5 million, it looks like. That is important. That doesn't make it any easier. My second year teaching, I taught next to someone, we had low enrollment in my school. We had to move a teacher to another part of Houston Independent School District. But it was the right thing to do because we need people teaching. We need to invest in our teachers, but we need that piece that is, as you're in front of kids. That is the highest calling of a system. Thank you for that. The central office reductions. I can imagine that there will be some days over the next year, and already are now, when it feels like it's on fire in the central office because you're trying to do 9 things in one day. But it is, who can ever forget the Boston superintendent who said, I'm going to teach during COVID? Who can forget that? And that's not to say that that should be the role in non-COVID times, but the more people in front of, the emphasis on folks in front of kids, that's the way we get the best outcomes. The exemplary projects is also a significant dollar amount and easy to be against until you hear the details of the exemplary thing. But still, you can't be about justice outside of your neighborhood if you are not about fairness in your own neighborhood. I hope my wife is not listening, but I will say I love my daughter. I am worried also about other students who are more in need in Arlington over the medium to long term. So exemplary projects is also courage. Everybody knows at this table that the cap on Thomas Jefferson, love it, but if you have the most, the cap makes sense to me. It's a small project, and also that every free and reduced lunch student absolutely should have their AP test paid for, but should me and my wife eventually, if my daughter takes AP schools, should we pay for it? Absolutely. Depending on what happens over the next 15 years for us. But that's a bunch of thoughts. I have one specific question, and I want to yield. I want to ask you to work with me on the details after this and my colleagues on the county board. After school, we have after-school students who are super in need, and we have reduced the number of students. There's a whole bucket of students who are super in need, and we are worried about them and fentanyl. There's another group of students who may not be those most that we worry most about substance, but they still need after school. They can't do, their parents can't do what my parents did, which is cart me all over to soccer practice. That's not a thing for a lot of parents. And so at Wakefield, in particular, I'll be wanting to work with you. We put some money aside, and I'd love to work with you to see if we can keep that building open enough, work with your new principal but work to see if there's a way to scale up a little bit of that work. It's harder to do perhaps to interest high school students than maybe some middle school students, but we have some one-time money there, and I want to spend it where there's need. And so that's the one thing that I'd love to have the chance. I probably have two other questions, and I see Dr. Duran ready to pounce on that, but that's the one question, and I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. DeFranti, for that. We would love to partner with you on that. First, I want to thank the county board and Mr. Schwartz for the investment already at Wakefield. We've already had a program there that has been yielding some really positive results, and I know Mr. Ballas would be excited. I'll speak for him to do more. One interesting one is we even found, I think it was one or definitely one student, maybe two, who are only coming to the after-school program, not during the day. It's like, okay, we want you to come to school, we want you to be engaged, but it was so, I just share that because how impactful the program was for that young man, for him to feel connected. And so now, obviously, he's coming during the day, and it was the connection, and that actually brought him there and brought the opportunity to help him come during the day. So we very much welcome that, and we really appreciate what you've done already in terms of the investment. Not only Wakefield at Kenmore, we also have had programming that we've started there. And so the more and more investment working together with you on those out of school time opportunities where we can engage students and want them to be involved and get them to be a part of their community in ways. The one program at Wakefield is setting them up for success for career. They're getting opportunities to practice how to interview, resumes, mentors coming in and talking to them about job opportunities, opening up the door. And that's just an opportunity that we wouldn't be able to always do without your support. So thank you, and look forward to more on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to drive home the points being made. Thank you, Mr. DeFranti, for highlighting specifically the after-school program, because I recently read a headline that statistics of opioid abuse are going down in Arlington and questioning the need for the after-school program. So to me, this is like having an umbrella in a rainstorm and then, saying, well, I can get rid of it because I'm not getting wet. So I just want to make that point that clearly we're seeing the impact of more investment in student mental health, in student support, and in services like this after-school program. So thank you. And I, for one of my goals as a school board member is to continue to hopefully, this has been an ask of us from community members, so to continue to work with the county to hopefully we can not just sustain, but increase after-school offerings. And as mentioned, and it's also something I have heard from students that they need and want. Even high school, actually mostly high school students have raised to me that they want more opportunities to come together in community outside of school. So these programs allow that, and I think all this data and statistics and research show that connectivity in community spaces breeds better more academic engagement, which breeds more academic achievement and helps us close gaps. So that is, I think, the connective tissue. And just one last point, clearly we're talking about, I think, two areas where this holds true, where the investment early and often actually saves us down the line, which is preschool, so high quality preschool programming, and after-school engagement. So that is my takeaway, that I think if we can together focus on how we better expand those two options, it goes a long way to saving us in the long run.
Thank you, Ms. Tapia. Hadley?
Just jump in really quickly to say I've also been grateful for, on the county side, the relaunch of the Arlington website, which is a great resource for folks who are watching, who are interested in learning about community-wide, not just at our schools, opportunities for teenagers to do after-school activities. So thank you for that and for all the work you're doing with libraries and parks and other kinds of after-school settings.
Indeed. And if I have to say, if memory serves, I remember every single meeting that we had. Yes, the motivation, the trigger was the opioid pandemic, but the intention and the reason was to add a tool, an educational tool, an improvement tool, an equity tool. So all this is nicely on the table without abatement. Ms. Coffey.
Thank you. A little tough to have incisive, critical questions as we kind of live react here, but I appreciate that the turnaround is short. And hopefully you appreciate that we will have questions later, probably. A topic that I don't think anyone has quite touched on yet, Where is APS at in the collective bargaining agreement process? I know a union has been ratified for all the teachers, but is there a CBA in place at this time?
There is a CBA in place for two of our bargaining units. Part of that agreement, though, was that we would reopen for compensation purposes and for our AEA, which is our license and our support staff. For our administrative staff, there is also a collective bargaining agreement in place, and they are currently up for renewal of that, and that there's still negotiations going on with that.
negotiation, okay.
So there are collective bargaining agreements for all three. One is up for renewal, and the other, the other two have the agreement that we would revisit wages, and that was part of that reopener for that only.
Okay, gotcha. And at least with the existing CBAs that are in place, and I understand perhaps a desire for renegotiation, are we fulfilling the obligation of what the existing CBA had written? Or is it hard to say because the agreement had been to come to a future agreement?
Well, the existing one, yes. In terms of the current negotiations, those are still being done, so.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm just thinking because I know we've gone back and forth around, you know, we're fully funding our existing CBAs, but there are staff that aren't covered by that, and we would like to do for them as much as
And
we
the
can.
ongoing discussions, clearly with our, our investment in compensation, we all agree that that is not enough, and there's still an agreement, I would say, part of the collective bargaining would agree that that's not enough, and so that's the discussion going on. But with regards to the revenue that we have,
Right.
that's where we are at the current moment. But I would say that all of us would want to do more, including our bargaining units, and through that discussion. But in terms of the one that was previously passed, that is in place.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're at least fulfilling the obligation we've agreed to at this point in time. I know that we're doing that on the county side, and that was part of our budget guidance. I think that's important. On, I think, integration station and then early education in general, I don't have any questions necessarily, as much as I think that this, provides yet another opportunity as we implement Ready Regions on our side and part of that is a coordinated enrollment system, looking across what APS provides, what the county provides, what the state provides, getting it all into one beautiful system that is still yet a dream that has not manifested, but will. Just having some more discussions as we go forward about, especially for priority populations, where can they be served? I think our risk and reach study that was redone this year does have some information specifically about deeper populations and, the 0 to 5 age group is not entirely your domain, which I think is like an important thing to recognize, right? Like K-12 schools is K-12, and it's great that we do a lot on the 0 to 5 age range. And, my background is in the kind of cradle to career mindset. And so it is really important, but also, we're doing a lot, you're doing a lot. How do we coordinate those to make efficiencies? And I know our staff and your staff have worked to have some of those conversations, but I just, want to highlight that even if it's not within APS, that children are able to be placed in new opportunities or programs. Maybe it's a county program, maybe it's looking at for those students who are special needs, who are also low income and can't afford a program on their own. That is a priority population within the state subsidy program. And so how can we get them into there? I know that we've likely gotten, I'm going to knock on wood, permission to clear our wait list for our subsidy program. And so we'll be enrolling more kids, and the state, I think, wants to prioritize the 0 to 5 population really strongly, even the 0 to 3 potentially. And so all to say, some challenges are also opportunities. And I think to something that Ms. Clark said, right, like the integration station program was like the beginning of a lot of these conversations. But the best practices and the models have moved so far since then, especially just with early education overall. And so, where can we all partner together to say, maybe 10 years ago, this wasn't how we thought about things, but now we really need to get together and collaborate. So not a question, but just some thoughts that are maybe helpful. And Kathleen, I see, yeah.
So we were in the ACTL meeting, February 25th, I think was the second part, and early childhood came and presented. The data there showed like 250 kids started APS without pre-K. So, obviously barriers to access, cost, childcare. And we know that. And so this is where, if we can look at this as an opportunity to really build up the programs, neighborhood schools, figure out ways to coordinate efforts, and ensure those kids that need the early childhood experience, that we can get that for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would just encourage us all to not differentiate between childcare and preschool, because it's all education and it's all care all at the same time, which is also why for me, I very importantly block the 0 to 5 altogether, because especially at that point in little young brains, every single experience is a learning experience. And so saying that one thing is care, but one thing is school really kind of undermines the critical work that our early childhood educators are doing, whether it's, between 9 and 3 p.m. or at 7 a.m. or at 6 p.m. It's all education and it's all care altogether.
Here, here. Ms. Cunningham.
Great. Well, thank you all. When we were here last year, we had some hard conversations and set off on a year-long adventure, picking up new friends along the way. So I really appreciate the deep work that is reflected here and that is still to come, it sounds like, in the next couple of weeks. And yeah, we are still catching up a little bit because you guys are moving quickly. So I suspect, Mr. Chair, we may need some follow-up time before we get to a final vote. But just jumping on a few things where my colleagues have started. On the integration station, can you clarify what capital needs are planned to bring those kids back into classrooms suitable for 2s and 3s in our existing schools? And then can you also clarify, I think at page 178, it notes that community-based students are excluded. How many community-based students are in the numerator here, and how do they get covered?
So capital needs in terms of the facility, so it's comparable to our other pre-K classrooms with restroom inside, bathroom inside, combo. Is that what you're asking about? I want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, like if you're moving them back into a 2-year-old needs different kinds of heights.
They need different
If I
heights.
remember
So
correctly from my
Our
time
facilities department
on the
is working
board.
very closely with actually looking at all of the students who are currently there by actual student, and then also simultaneously looking at we're having a parallel conversation looking at available space in our schools, elementary schools where there might be classroom space, or that if we have to open up new programs. And then a third arm is our Office of Special Education, looking at existing programs that already have some slots available for some of those students where the facilities is already set up. So it's 3 parts. It's 1, identifying where there may be space in schools. Within that are those already preschool type classrooms, and we do have some of those. And if there aren't, identifying that. And that's, I said earlier, the long-term vision of do we need to have any investment in our capital projects moving forward if we are going to make those investments. But then immediately looking at, are there some available space in some existing programs? And if not, are there rooms and buildings that would already have the ability facility-wise, and then we would have staffing that would need to take place. And then part of the proposal, as I said, we're not reducing any of the staffing connected to integration station as proposal, it's the tuition.
And so do you have a number you're estimating for the capital?
I don't have the number with me now, we can follow up with you on.
Okay. And then what about the numerator question of the kids that aren't actually physically at the integration station but are supported by that team?
I will follow up with you on that
Okay.
one too.
Okay. 43
I
additional?
think so, but I want to be,
Okay.
I think that's correct, but I want to make sure I give you the right number, so I don't want.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Sorry.
No,
Your point. Okay. And then I think the other thing we talked a lot about last year was debt service. So, and it's a very interesting time in the bond markets, I understand. How are you guys thinking about that this year, and how, maybe more broadly, how are you thinking about contingency planning and worst-case scenario planning in a world that seems to be having some of those scenarios play out?
Sure. Debt service, let me take one step back for folks who are watching. So debt service obviously is the money that we pay when we take out bond debt and we're repaying our loans for our capital projects. And we do our capital improvement plans every 2 years. So we approved our latest 10-year capital improvement plan we approved last June. It included funding for some necessary upgrades and major infrastructure projects like finishing our vestibule project for school security, kitchen renovations, roofing and HVAC in the area of major infrastructure. And it also included funding for long-term renovation, funding to complete our Career Center, now Grace Hopper project for our Arlington Tech and CTE students, and other programs there like our PEP program. And then looking at our existing stock of our facilities and thinking about doing study to understand sort of triaging their needs and understanding which ones need sort of mid-level renovation or expansion, which ones need a more significant overhaul. And those studies are being done right now, the first 5 of those, and we expect those back this spring. This is the off year of our CIP, so we will be gearing up to do a CIP direction again next fall, and then a 2026 CIP, where we hope to be able to take the results of those feasibility studies for the first 5 of our existing buildings and figure out how we phase them in. We know that debt service, the money that we repay to do all of that kind of work, is actually the second largest expense in our operating budget after staffing. This year it amounts to, I think it's 8.2% of our overall operating budget. And so we take very seriously looking at the responsible management of that, because every dollar that we're spending on debt service in our operating budget is a dollar that we don't have for the kinds of things that we've just been talking about. One of the things we talked about in the work to date this year, and we may bring up again before we get to May, is the question of how we, looking at ways we can manage the debt service through some different kinds of approaches to financing. Our assistant superintendent for finance could talk about this much more eloquently, but the basic question was, we maintain a capital reserve. The basic question was, if we pulled money out of capital reserve and we used it to pay forward so that we reduce the amount that we'd be dependent on debt service, would that in fact yield cost savings? Would it be a better approach to how we manage just our general bucket of capital money? We talked with your debt manager about this idea and received counsel that in fact it would be advisable and a smart thing to do. And the general idea would be, if you took $10 million out of our capital reserve, you applied that in a forward-looking way to what would have been funded with bond debt, what would be the reduction? And the analysis that we've done shows that we would save in our operating budget, for example, next year, it would shave $1 million off of debt service payment in our operating budget. And when we look out over future years, over sort of a 10-year window, the following year it would be $900,000, and it maintains at a fairly robust rate over this 10-year period to reduce the amount of debt service that we pay out of our operating budget. $10 million investment now would yield 15-point-some million dollars of actual benefit over that time period. So that may be something that we look at as a way to reduce debt service. The other ways to reduce debt service, of course, are to take on fewer capital projects. And so when my colleagues are doing next year's CIP, that will be a discussion that they will need to have about whether we can in fact afford, whether our aspirations and our finance can be matched. So that would be a discussion that our incoming chair, likely Ms. Ecker-Sutton, would be having with the board next fall and throughout next year. Anybody want to add to that on our side?
I think I would just, a nuance to, I think what I heard you say is that the advice we got was that if we were to decide to do it, there is an advisable route. I don't believe that we were advised to do this. We were advised how to do it.
And then to the question, the overall question of worst-case scenario planning, of which there's plenty ahead, I think. How are you positioning that with some drastic changes at the federal level and potentially flowing down through the states?
I'm glad you raised that because actually it's something I wanted to flag in connection with something else in the operating budget. So when we talked about, when you saw the slides that we just went through, Dr. Duran in his part of the presentation identified 5.54 million that we could achieve by optimizing student-teacher ratios within existing class size. And the way we do that is we look at our projected enrollment from springtime all the way through the beginning of the following school year. And if we're keeping sort of a laser focus on what we see the actual numbers at each school and across different subject areas, we see those rise and fall, we can make real-time adjustments in staffing so that what we would hope to avoid would be situations where we have some of our classrooms that are a little bit higher than we would like, and we have other classrooms where the ratios are considerably lower than our class size ceiling. So an example would be in a first grade in one of our elementary schools. In spring, we may think we need 5 first grade classrooms. As we get closer to the start of school and we look at actual registrations and who may be moving out and who may be coming in, we may find that we didn't need 5. We actually just needed 4. And so rather than pay for staffing for 5, we can consolidate and have 4. And the way that we have to do that, as I mentioned, is this kind of laser-like real-time focus on tracking enrollment, and we have to be willing as a school system to make adjustments even after the start of school. So you think about the first 2 weeks of school, we know we have a lot of last-minute registrations. We as a community have to be willing to say, you know what? It may be that your child gets moved into a different classroom. That's not an unheard of situation today, that on the first day of school, your teacher doesn't remain your teacher. We know we have long-term subs in some of our classrooms for hard-to-fill positions. We have people who are out on sick leave or maternity leave. So it happens in certain ways today, and it is a practice, the sort of adjustment based on enrollment is a practice that certain other school divisions employ, and it's something that may be part of this optimization that I talked about. This connects with the question about worst case scenario and plan B in capital, because we, like you, are in this situation now that's rather unprecedented, where we don't know what is happening to the livelihoods of many people in our community, unfortunately. And the impacts of what is happening to our federal workforce and our federal adjacent employees in our community makes our enrollment prediction a little more volatile than we would like. So an example would be we may have families who were stationed abroad and they are no longer employed in that way, and they come back to Arlington and they enroll their kids in public school. We've already seen that at one of our high schools with USAID families. We may have families that can't afford private school that come back to Arlington Public Schools. We may have families that decide they can't live in this area because they've lost their employment and they move elsewhere. So we, like you, have to be very careful about understanding how all of this will impact our enrollment and our staffing and our capital planning when we think about what will be the size of our student body at different grade levels and across the community, and how will that impact this notion that we have about available capacity and how we manage our portfolio of facilities.
I would also just, going back to something that Dr. Duran mentioned earlier, the state, the governor, I can't remember, excuse me, I can't remember if it was the governor's office that is doing the $1,000 bonus, or if it is the.
That's the General Assembly's adopted budget.
Yeah, the General Assembly's adopted budget has a $1,000 bonus. That costs us considerably more money. That happened a couple years ago in January, where there was a 2% increase. That cost us a tremendous amount of money in the middle of our fiscal year. So it may be the case that we are going to have to make decisions along the way that unfortunately put us at a little bit of a disadvantage in the region if the other school districts do take those funds and do give those increases. But if it's if we are really struggling, that is something that we may simply not be able to do. And it goes back to state funding and the needs that we have to shift the SOQ and remove the support cap and just make those fundamental changes at the state level.
Mrs. Spain, I see you. Just a little footnote to that. Uncertainty is just a very polite term right now. There is certainty about something. The certainty is that there will be impact. The impact is already happening. We just are at the very beginning of quantifying that. And since in many ways your budget performance depends on our budget performance, you can be rest assured that this is the first instance of response, and we will have to come back to this table and discuss how we manage, depending on the type of impact, the human cost of the impact, the fiscal size of the impact, and also the structural parts of this discussion. This is not a natural phenomenon in economic terms. This is a policy-driven impact, a policy-driven crisis. It's self-inflicted. It's perfectly discretionary at this point. So it is very difficult to pin down what exactly you'll do. What we need to be ready as a community is to be ready to have some sort of a classification of, what is the first line of defense, the second line of defense, etc. With all due respect, I understand the optimization is what a normal person would think about, how do we deal with a downturn, for example, or economic crisis, or, a phenomenon. But we may have to deal with more, and that will impact our workforce. I'm always very respectful to the fact that you're responsible for 15,000 people. We are responsible for 4,000 people, Mr. Manager. So in terms of, how we talk about workforce, how we talk about, flexibilities, I wanted to ask you about what retention really is and what does it mean, 89% retention? And, but I will leave it for a little bit less because I see Mr. Spain's light.
Yeah, I guess this starts our round two of questions, right?
Yes, sir.
So Superintendent Duran, you and I, you know that I have an affinity for especially our military families, many of whom are attending APS schools. Can you talk a little bit about the Military Family Initiative and the Student Ambassador Program? And again, as my colleague, Ms. Coffey, talked about, we're just kind of like getting this budget. And I did a quick search. I didn't see much of anything in there, but what is the relationship like, and any investments as we, in that program, the MVI, as we go into this next budget cycle?
So this year, the first year we did do the impact aid application, where we were trying to identify families that were military connected to actualize some dollars from the federal government. So that's something that we're still working through in terms of anticipated, I think, about $400,000, but we're still working through what that would look like. So that's where we are in terms of our military families.
Great.
And that relates to the budget. There's a lot more we do, but relating to the budget.
Great. And I did happen to also search it, Madam Chair. This is a question at a time when DEI has been under attack across this great nation, even in corporate space, the military, you name it, private sector. I noticed that we're cutting some positions within our DEI framework, or no. Communities in school, data coordinator, we're not cutting any positions within DEI at APS. Okay, good.
May I share?
Please.
Yesterday, we did our Employees of the Year, so we had our Teacher of the Year, Principal of the Year, Assistant Principal of the Year, Support Staff of the Year, and Leader of the Year. And the Leader of the Year was our Executive Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
I would also just chime in to say, those of you that are interested in our DEI work and how that plays out now in the new context we find ourselves in, I would encourage you to watch the recording of our February 27th school board meeting, where we had a rather in-depth presentation, a monitoring report from our DEI team, all of whom remain with us, and also at our schools, the full complement of our equity coordinators.
The reduction that you see of data coordinator, it's under the general auspice of our chief DEI and student support services department. And so that data coordinator is not in actually the DEI, it's under the student services. It was a position that was created but never filled. And so it was a vacant position. So it's not directly connected to DEI, but it is in our student services department. So that's maybe why you saw it under DEI.
Okay. And as I close out here, a little bit about safety. I just have so much I wish we could be here all night, but I don't think people are ready for that. I see we're adding 6 positions. Can you talk a little bit about those personnel? Like, the 3 elementary schools in particular, I think aren't identified, or I haven't found them yet. Have you identified those 3 elementary schools where you're going to put those individuals?
No, these individuals support all of our elementary schools. They'll be
You're going to spread them around?
They'll be geographically one north, central, and south assigned to those schools. We currently don't have any elementary schools with a full-time, and this would be, right now, when there are issues and needs that come about, we have to pull from our middle and high school to send someone to a school. Let's say there's something going on, they may need to stay there for a week, or to go provide support in the mornings. So these 3 would now be able to be dedicated to a cluster of schools. So those 3 would be clustered around the geographic locations of.
And the additional 3 folks will be for aquatics, places where your aquatic center?
Yes.
What drove that decision?
We currently do not have any security dedicated to the aquatic center, and we have changed our protocols for how we have community members and staff members, anyone come to enter the building. We now have the Raptor program where they have to be identified. And as a result of that, we hadn't any staff to manage that. We have our lifeguard staff which tend to be, younger teenagers or individuals. We don't want to put that on them. So we want to make sure that those facilities are safe. We've shifted our entering and exiting process. So that's why we need to have dedicated staff to that.
Well, thank you. This will conclude my round of questioning for today. For right now, I'll just close by saying, the space in which I previously occupied, there's a lot of conversation about, when we talk about equity, who's missing, who are we serving? We know there are challenges with individuals in our minority communities that are graduating, many of whom not even being able to read still. Thus goes back to my question earlier about how much money we're putting into these pupils, our students. Those are challenges. We're having challenges with making sure we have the right size of behavioral health specialists, mental health professionals within our schools. I know there's advocates out here in our community that would love to see a nurse at every school. That in of itself costs a lot of money, but that will be the North Star we would like to go to. And finally, as we think about compensation, and I understand you're going to do a 2% across the board with a COLA. Have you been given any consideration of making that perhaps 1% versus 2%? I know you're trying to stay competitive. You got the 12.24 million in COLA. Have you ever, why 2, not 1?
Let's ask Josh.
I was arguing for 4.
Look, I think we all have buckling down and have to tighten our belts. I get it. We want to stay competitive. I'm just saying, how did you land on 2?
And if you saw my in front of knees, I would land at 6. But my slide. But I think that 1, we wanted to ensure that we stayed competitive as much as possible, and so we're trying to project what that might look like. 2, ensuring we have at least the 3%, because otherwise we would not be even to draw it down. Even though, as Ms. Secretary Sutton mentioned, and I mentioned also, we don't get 3% isn't exact the amount of 3% we need. We get a very limited amount. But to try and stay in alignment with that, we need to be able to draw down those dollars for the 3%. If we don't have it, we won't get that. But I just think we have to remain competitive. We have to retain our staff. 2% to me isn't even enough. I guess it was in the confine of what we were able to do with regards to the revenue we saw, the deficit that we had, and trying to also invest in some way in our student needs, students with disabilities, our English learners, the planning factor. changes that we put in place. So really trying to balance all of that, working with the school board. I say we, so if anyone else would like to chime in, but really trying to find what was the most that we could do given the current reality of the revenue. And I think we would love to even do more than that. We talked about different ways, but then what were the cuts and what were the impact we're going to have to have? And we started seeing that those impact and cuts would go closer and closer to student-facing positions.
Sure.
And we wanted to stay away from student-facing positions as much as possible. So for every increase that we do, 1% or decrease, it's about $6 million. So if we wanted to do more, $6 million more of cuts, we don't have the revenue coming in at that level. And so that was our dilemma, was how do we do more? And where's the point where we can have our priorities still of investment and not touch student-facing positions as much as possible? So I'll speak for myself there, but I will turn to any school board member that'd like to share. But again, I wouldn't go lower. I'd go as high as we could.
I would just comment quickly that we look at it, year over year. We did 1% last year. And we felt like it would not be appropriate to go below 2% this year.
I would also just jump in and say that sorry, I didn't see your line. That we, Ms. Coffey asked the question about collective bargaining, right? And so when we sit down with our bargaining units and we talk about compensation, we are trying to be good faith partners with our bargaining units and get as close as we can to the requests that they're making. And so we talked a little bit last night about sort of the timeline of collective bargaining and the need to put forward a budget. We can't have a budget that's completely silent on compensation where it's a TBD because it is the major expense. So we needed to plant a flag in the ground with our proposed budget, and 2% we felt like, was a good faith effort to try to meet our bargaining partners closer to where they wanted to be.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have so many thoughts on this. I mean, our educators are on from the moment they walk in the building. They have to be on, engaged, and they are in front of our students who we expect to learn. Why wouldn't we value that and prioritize that first? There isn't a single thing that I wouldn't do to make sure that we are prioritizing those positions and the compensation for them, because the expectation of them is so high. I don't want them to have to think about where they're going to make up the difference in their budget, their own personal financial budget, to be able to live and work in APS. I want them to be able to focus on what they love to do, which is educate our children. And when I think about, I was trying to chime in your other question about DEI, I think this all connects. This is all about driving outcomes. You cannot drive outcomes for students when they are worried about if they fit in, that access piece. DEI serves such an important place in our community to help ensure that we are talking about all these things that frankly people don't want to talk about. But as a parent of children with disabilities, ableism is rampant in the community. DEI serves a place there to help educate the greater community about how we can work to unlock the access for these children that learn differently. And so if you take that DEI space and then you add in this component here of compensating the people that are directly educating our children, I would never walk away from this table under 2%.
Thank you. Go ahead, Zora, because I need to close out.
Thank you. Just one last thing, too, that in the last couple of years, certainly since the current governor came in, requirements and demands put on by the state, unfunded demands put on by the state, not just to our system, but specifically to our teachers, increased testing, increased administrative duties. Their duties are increasing in a way that is not in keeping with compensation. So I think this is also reflective of us trying to be cognizant of that, even though at the state level funding is still an issue.
I'm glad my question triggered robust response. And and I fully support whatever we can give our teachers. More is always better, I believe wholeheartedly, and we want to recruit and retain the best and brightest and build out a very diverse portfolio of educators here in Arlington. And to the Military Family Initiative, Mr. Superintendent, let's stay in contact with that. I'm very passionate about not only all of our students and teachers, but more especially that cause that you and I are kind of also aligned with. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and that concludes my questions for today.
Thank you, Mr. Spain. I see all the lights from Ms. Coffey to Mr. DeFerrari to Ms. Cunningham. Just a little editorial from me. There is a reason why we talk about that frames the mind here. 84% of the EPS budget is payroll. So, and as you know, there are two ways to do that, to manage the payroll. And in your slide, that's 9, it's very clear to me how we have been lagging woefully behind. Not in comparison to somebody else, and I'm not referring to Mr. Forbes' red shaded spreadsheets. I'm referring to how we value our workforce, what we expect from our workforce, and how we structure for success and our outcomes oriented, right? So part of the conversation that we started with your all help last year was to figure out what are the strategic decisions. It's not about how much we pay people. It is about paying them well and paying them a fair salary and a competitive salary. It's about how we make the best use of our workforce so that we have this dividend that justifies the effort. So personally, I really got stuck on one term that you use, which is student-centered workforce. There are things that 89% retention rate. I still don't know exactly what retention rate means. Does it mean that a new teacher doesn't leave immediately? Does it mean that
all employees year to year, the percentage of employees that are remaining as employees from year to year.
But for example, the goal is 75% of people to feel that they are in a positive and productive workplace. 75%, right? That's the goal. That means that 1 out of 4 is okay to feel that they're not in a positive and helpful. It says here. Yeah. Follow. At least 75%.
Yeah, I think you're referring to our Your Voice Matters survey results from our staff. And when we look at measures, and it's an aggregate measure that's across several questions, we look at employee engagement and satisfaction. And we are looking at setting a benchmark and then trying to exceed the benchmark. And so we are tracking in the strategic plan those multiple measures of engagement and satisfaction and looking at ways to increase that. We know that when it comes to retention, there are monetary aspects of that, compensation. We know there are non-monetary benefits of that, which is about workplace culture and other kinds of factors that feed into somebody's decision to stay or go. And so we're trying to look at all of that when we're looking at raising that.
And for me, this is extremely important because this is, my sister's an educator. I can tell you that she's not half as well compensated than the worst compensated educator in NPS. Yet she's hanging in and she's going to spend her entire life doing that for reasons. Right.
If I could just tag on and connect the dots with a comment or a question that came earlier from Ms. Cunningham. When I look at our budget and when I think about our debt service, and it is directly related to improvement projects in our school buildings are the work environment of our employees. And so I look at the debt service and the renovation projects and the rehabilitation of buildings as an investment in our employees as well as compensation. So those are two different, it's a capital budget and then an operating budget, and they're linked through the debt service. But to me, it is part of one big continuum of taking care of our employees.
Thank you. Ms. Coffey.
Thank you. I thought I was done, and then brought up the General Assembly, and I had more questions. No, hopefully this will be short. I believe our #1 legislative priority this year, like yours, was for them to fund the JLARC study recommendations. I know it was the #1 priority of VACO and of VML, and so advocacy-wise, we've tried. And I believe that the General Assembly passed budget that has gone to the governor does include some improvements. Can you talk a little bit about what those improvements are, and is that already folded into this proposed budget, or would that be an improvement beyond what's in the proposed?
What's in the proposed budget is connected to the General Assembly's proposal. And so there were some changes to some of the opportunities for how they're funding. For example, our special education, EL population, there's some changes to that. Looking at, so there have been improvements in that area, but they're not much yet, and we don't know what the governor will sign.
Yeah.
But anything that was included there is included in our overall, yes.
Okay, great.
But it ain't perfect.
And at the same time, there's still things on the table, such as the reduction of the number of semesters for an English learner to
Reach the.
right, and that connects to accreditation, and that connects to how much money we have to spend to serve our students. So while we're achieving some wins, modest wins in certain areas, we are still fighting tremendous challenges in others that do really ultimately to our budget.
The part that has not changed that really affects us, though, is the way that dollars are allocated with the LCI and the standard of quality approach, and which positions are really looked at. And also when we look at how they provide funding for the average salary across the Commonwealth for those standard of quality, and we're well above that. So no consideration for that in there in terms of how other states look at actual, or they look at per pupil expenditures, they look at the type of students you serve, just this average, and then looking at only positions that are under standard of quality and only funding for those without recognizing that we have other opportunities for needs. That's the part that's not changed. That's the fundamental. So they did make some progress in some other ways. They provided dollars to categories, but the foundational piece is the critical part that needs to change. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for structural deficit moving on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's really helpful to understand, and we will all pray on the governor's decisions here. But I think that's really helpful context as more messaging comes out around the state budget, because it's always a little, you have to look under the hood to really understand what some of these changes mean. So I appreciate that, and with that, that is my last question.
Thank you, Ms. Coffey. Vice Chair DeFerranti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will delay one topic, which is on meals, on March 24th, which is the governor's date, and real estate tax till after we do the county piece of it. I do want to make a couple of comments returning to the theme that this is a serious budget. There are two pieces that I just feel compelled. I'm sure people might not tell me to say them, but I'm going to say them. The proposal on integration station is a serious proposal. Of course, the research says that the youngest kids need the most services. It's also the case that when I started teaching, we didn't believe in inclusion in 1995 to a large extent. Inclusion works. There's evidence now that when I was an advocate for the Education Trust, everyone said testing used to not be done for special education students. It has to be done. So it's a serious proposal. I'll give space to parents who don't want it, but there should be, if you get into HB, it is a lottery for a reason. The other three major high schools are excellent high schools, but it is also the case that the 48 students at Integration Station are in a different setting. And so I just have to submit that, because there has to be, if the services are there and the 80% is right, I just have to say it. It's your lane, but I don't think we as a collective body should not at least say that we find your proposals on that as a group to be serious. That's one thought. The second is your planning factors are emphasizing English learners and special education students. Even as you are making cuts, you are making investments. That is what equity means. It doesn't just mean special education students. It means English learners and students of color, which overlap, of course, quite often. And so I just want to commend you again. Not perfect. I'm not happy talk. It's still a lot of money that we're investing, but this is serious, and I'm grateful.
Ms. Khan. Ms. Khan. Oh, yes, you can. Just
Very briefly, I think we did not touch on summer school, which I saw had some cut backs, and we didn't go too deeply on performance and outcomes. And so I wanted to just give a little space for how are we doing with this great investment that we make in our community, and what's going on with summer school. How can the broader community support our students and our achievement, whether it's in those after-school programs, volunteer work, et cetera.
So for our summer school, we've looked at the last several years to see the investment we've made across all students, to see where have been impacts in terms of that opportunity. And we've not seen, in all cases, a large impact, positive impact with the dollars being invested. So this year we thought, how can we reimagine and repurpose our funds to really target those students most in need from an equitable perspective? And so one thing we've done was we have changed the way we provide this summer for K-8 students summer learning opportunities. We're creating a new program for our English language learners, targeting those at levels 1 and 2 to support them in acquiring English. We're continuing our summer school programming that we do for our students with disabilities, and we're continuing our high school programming for students that need additional credits, particularly for graduation, and then obviously those that want to pay for the advancement of different courses that's allowed. So that's been our approach. And for those other students who are not English learner students, who are students that are in K-8 needing additional support, we have seen some success with our all-in tutoring program we've done and some tutoring support. So we are looking at how we can provide tutoring to them during the summer while working closely with the county. And thank you, Mr. Schwartz and your team, about how do we provide expanded opportunities for enrichment during the day for those students. And so we've co-located more programs in our elementary schools for that opportunity for families. We even had the opportunity for families to sign up earlier, opened up the opportunity for them to sign up earlier if they were for those programs. So we're trying that approach. So what's worked, what are some ways that we've seen, and then what are our needs? And we definitely see needs for our English learners to not have that time. And then also reimagine the program, because our English learners were always in our summer school programs, but we're purposely developing one that's around English language acquisition with them, with their needs at the forefront, while then making sure other students receive some tutoring opportunities and enrichment opportunities, and definitely not making changes to what was there for the high school students and for our students with disabilities in that program as well.
Great, thank you. And I think on our side, the youth strategic plan is about to amp up, and I think that'll be a really important place for us all to put those theories and identify the pilots that we want to do. Our community is going through really hard times, and one of the things that people want to do is to serve with and help others. So I hope that, like we are doing, you can really look for those USAID and other folks who are going through transitions to consider volunteering or consider subbing or even coming in. I know you're doing that already. So
Tomorrow we have a job fair at Wakefield. So anyone listening, we have a job fair, and we have opportunities at the job fair as well for individuals that might want to do career change and they're interested perhaps in teaching. We do have opportunities for that through non-traditional routes. So welcome people to come tomorrow to Wakefield.
Terrific, thank you.
We know how important,
Okay. Susan, thank you for that comment on volunteerism. One of the ways in which we're
And
trying.
remember, you have better microphones than we do, so you got to get close.
Okay.
It's really just how we suffer over here.
Thank you for your comments on volunteerism. One of the things we've been looking at is trying to expand our pool of resources, which can be monetary, but it also can be person hours. And I wanted to thank everyone for their engagement, but Matt, you particularly for your comments. And I said this last night, but I think Mary deserves a tremendous amount of credit for getting us to this point. And I think that all of our staff has supported our many questions, our many meetings, and performed very well with a lot of patience for us. So thank you for that. We have heard at the board from, I would say, three main populations: in an integration station, our librarians, and our ITCs. And I just wanted to mention that today because we, on this side of the table, are continuing to look at some questions around that, even though it's not necessarily been discussed today. And then I also wanted to say a lot of our discussion today has been on our special populations, which is appropriate and I think consistent with equity, But I wanted to say again that one of the major accomplishments, I think, of this budget is not raising class sizes, which is a benefit to all of our students across the board. And all of our students are at top of mind all the time with respect to how we serve them, how we're able to support them, provide trusted adults in close relationships, provide a rigorous education. And we do talk a lot about our special populations, but our whole student body is part of this budget. And I really think the effort on compensation and on maintaining lower class sizes is something we worked very hard for, and we ought to be proud of it.
Thank you. I said before that our microphones are not good. Maybe we need some ITC investment here, right? Yeah. So for the general public, ITC stands for Instruction Technology Coordinators. This is kind of jargon in this house. So I'm just saying that these are important people because they make all this environment of teaching actually work. So it is not a minor issue to reduce their work time. I use this example just to remind everybody that we register, like every Arlingtonian, we value our librarians, we value the people who have been working for many years in Integration Station and everybody else. It is definitely not our role to make these decisions for you. You are the elected representatives of everybody to make these decisions. What I have to tell you is that I'm really thankful for an enormous effort to reduce the front-loaded deficit of the program of APS, and then set up the system for continuing to respond to the fiscal realities as they evolve right now. All right, I see a lot of resilience in your budget, way more than it was before. That gives us, a better feeling, and also it sets up the conversation as we will be evolving down this. So take, for example, on the discussion about front paying some of, into the debt service so that you reduce the debt service further up. So you have to front pay some capital so that you get up. We do it as well. We don't do that happily because we miss these dollars. So there is not a one size fits all. There is not always the one and only right answer to the question. And we really appreciate the discussion about outcomes because this is where the right or wrong of answers will be judged. So, and with that, I think that we can now ask Mr. Swartz.
I'll do it so well.
Yeah, to set the frame for whatever is possible.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know, and you think, I think I know this is a fact that every member of the school board paid close attention when I made my presentation on February 22nd, and had been tuning into all our work sessions. So I'm going to give you an abbreviated presentation rather than the 35-slide presentation to hit some of the highlights and some of the challenges we face. So you can see with our overall budget summary by the numbers, it's a close to $1.7 billion budget, which is a 2.1% increase. And you can see the county operating side of that is a little bit over $1 billion. Now, the school transfer, that $647 million, we have over 200 lines of business in the county. Our number one line of business is schools. You are the biggest appropriation, and that's the way it should be. And we spend a lot of time, I think, glossing over the fact that we have an approach and a sharing arrangement that I think makes that part of the process easier. I didn't say it was easy. It makes it easier than some of the other processes we go through. So I think that's really important. And we also were able to increase the level of ongoing funding we have going to you by 3.6%, which I think is good. And I think that's assisted, at least I've been talking to the superintendent, in you putting together a budget that meant that you could rely a little bit less on some of your reserves. So wanted to make sure I hit upon that. So if we can go to the next slide. We have, just like what happened with what we just heard from you on the schools, we did a combination of things in proposing the budget. And so we did a series of service and program reductions. We also took a look at ways to increase revenue. So I'll talk a little bit about here and more on a subsequent slide. We did a little bit over $12 million in service and program reductions. We did propose to reduce 45 FTEs, of which about half of them were filled. And so we've been going through the work sessions with the county board, going through each of the departments, and paying attention to the fact that there are there are people in those slots. We're trying very, very hard, and I think we'll be, for the most part, successful, maybe not fully successful, to find other places for those people to go in our organization. Sometimes the skills are not an exact fit, and the budget is with the county board. The county board may not agree with some of the cuts that have been put on the table, or may have other suggestions. So we spent a lot of time focusing on that. We also spent some time focusing on making sure that if we had vacant positions that weren't necessary, we could look at those. And then we did reduce debt service. I know there was a conversation earlier about debt service, and I'll touch on that a little bit more when we get to the question about the uncertainty we're facing. On the revenue side, we are proposing an increase in the meals tax, which was instituted in 1991. It has not increased since then. The General Assembly gave us the authority to increase that a few years ago. We're proposing a 1% increase in the meals tax from 4% to 5%, and we are consistent with the revenue sharing principles. Sharing that amount, you can see on this slide, schools will be getting $6.2 million if the board agrees to raise that meals tax by 1%. We're also spend a lot of time, and appropriately, looking at how we're recovering fees. The county has as I said, many lines of business, and recovering fees from our customers, making sure that they are paying for the services that they're getting, most specifically in two areas. One is our development fund, which is under enormous stress because it's a self-sustaining fund that relies on the amount of business that our developers do and the amount of residential building and inspections. And that has been going through a really difficult transition along post-COVID about the switch from office to home, the lack of office projects in the county that have been putting downward pressure on our revenue streams. Let's go to the next slide. I did want to spend a lot of time on the upper left-hand stabilization reserve bullet there. So normally, when we're going through a budget, we do try to pay attention to making sure that we have funds set aside for what we need in anticipation of unforeseen circumstances. This year, this proposal you see is extraordinary. I don't want to say it's extraordinary, but it's extraordinary, which means that we're doing something that we haven't done before. We have two sets of reserves. One I call the Armageddon Fund, which you can't touch unless the world's coming to an end. We have another set of economic and budget stabilization reserves, which are at 1.3%. We're proposing we increase that to 2%. And so and I think you'll see in our budget, we have assessed that we receive about $88 million in funding from the federal government. Embedded in that $88 million is a big chunk for schools when it comes to school lunches and those kinds of finances. So I'm not committing the county board to do anything, but I'm saying these reserves are available in case any of that $88 million is affected. And so we have our concerns whether that's enough. I don't think it's too much at this point, so we will have to see what happens. And also, apropos of some of the things that we had talked about before, which are we do have levers to talk about in slowing down spending if we find out that there have been impacts. As of today, as of Friday on Pi Day, we have only heard of one instance where there's been any funding on the county side that has had a potential impact on the federal changes, and that is related to changes on reimbursement for breakfast and meal programs in our Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center, Argus House, We just heard, there was an article about this in the Washington Post today about the Agriculture Department cutting back on a program worth about $1 billion. That'll have an impact, we're looking at, to check it, could have an impact of around $200,000 on the county side. So we'll have some more information on that. But the fact is, and I've talked to all the county board members about this, and I like the opportunity to explain to the community, even though there has been psychological devastation going on with what's going on, with the loss of what's happening in federal employment, when it comes to actual numbers and drawing down of funds, as of right now, that's the only impact we have. But we're not being foolish about this. We know there could be a lot more. So we also have the risk of federal funding for our nonprofit partners, which we have heard about and we will be paying attention to. The lower left, we have WMATA. There's no local funding solution after fiscal 26, which causes us a great deal of concern. I also have another concern, which is what happens with the District of Columbia, potentially losing $1 billion. And I mean, actually, they're not losing it. They get to keep the money, they just can't spend it. It just gets to sit there and they can't touch it. And what will happen to that when it comes to how we finance the local government contributions to our metro system? That's an issue that we will have to figure out how to handle that. We have a lot of stressors in housing and human services. We made sure that we did additional investments here in our safety net, and we did not. And I don't have a slide here talking about all the additional investments we did, but you should know in our housing grant program and all the other safety net programs we have, we continued our commitment to make sure that those services would be available. And then bottom right, I don't even know what that's talking about. And what is that? Oh, schools budget. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. This is, I didn't want to have slides about each of these things. This is an example, a subset. I wanted to lay out what some of the reductions that we had put on the table, and you can see there's a little box on each of them. I'm happy to answer questions on them. The point of this slide is to show that we took cuts in almost all departments in the county. Some of them, I think, that are cuts that we can sustain. I think it makes sense in a $1.7 billion budget that you find places to cut things. Some of these cuts will have impacts on services and programs that we deliver. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We spent a lot of time talking about, and I know that Mr. Spain was able to elicit a lot of conversation on this subject. So the question about compensation for employees. So we're consistent with our collective bargaining agreements. We are maintaining, and we've done above and beyond what we actually had in our collective bargaining agreements. We are offering to our 3 certified union groups pay that is 11% for our fire and 9% for police. And I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about that. That is in recognition of the intense environment where recruitment. We are down 16 to 17% in our police staffing, and our fire department is down not quite as much, but the stress on them and the amount of work that's being done is really unsustainable. So we need to figure out how to increase the funding there. Our service and labor and trades agreement, 4% increase there. And that in that agreement is built-in range movement, which means we do not have a grade and step system across most of our organization. We have it with fire and police, but that means the lower end and the top end of the scale get moved up so that people, if they bounce up against the ceiling, if we want to give them 4% and they only had 1% pay potential, that means that we raise the ceiling by 2%, so they could get 3%, a lot of numbers in there. Benefits, we're continuing our commitment to child and elder care. We have, I know you've increased your amount of leave. We have 16 weeks on our side. I would have liked to have done more, but this just wasn't the year for us to do it. And then for most of our non-collective bargaining agreement, we're going to have 3.5% for general employees and that 2% range movement. And I've been asked before, how did I come up with 3.5%? We did a survey of what's going on generally in the region, and I still am on speaking terms with my colleagues in Loudoun because they have too much money and they don't know what to do with it, okay? And my friends in Prince William, they're sort of in the same position. But mostly what we were hearing is that pay is going up somewhere between 3 to 4% in the region. But I will say, and we might get a question about this, there have been times in the past where I've been manager for 9 years. There was a year where I didn't propose any pay increases because that was during COVID, where we were in tough circumstances. So we try to balance all of that. I think it's really important to commit to our employees who are here and doing that hard work to do that. I know it's not, Francisco and I have talked about this a lot. I don't think that we need to have the same percentage that schools have. I mean, I think there are some years where you should be higher because you're in a much more competitive environment, and some years where we're different. We have different job classifications. So the fact that this 3.5 doesn't match your 4 point whatever overall, which is an average, I think that makes complete sense. We're seeing a lot of pressure on health insurance premiums. This is something we don't have any control over. So we are self-insured. So that could mean in a given year where we have a difficult set of illnesses in the organization or premature babies, those things really drive up our healthcare costs. We spent a lot of time, and we instituted 2 years ago, a very high deductible healthcare plan. We have a range of choices that I think offer people the option of assessing their own risk and making decisions for themselves. But we pay somewhere close to 80% of the premiums for employees. So this is an increase for them on the 20% share, but it's also a big increase for county taxpayers to assist with that funding. So let's go to the next slide. Schools. So I know you've talked about this, and I just wanted to make sure that people understood that we have, under the revenue sharing principles, 46.8% of tax revenues are shared with Arlington Public Schools. And we talked about a little bit about what was the principles behind that. Now on our side, we're also raising fees. Those aren't shared. And there's, we spend a lot of time, and I just did want to say on this part, we spend a lot of time, I know Francisco and I and the budget staffs, trying to calculate where we think that 46.8% is going to be. And I just wanted to thank the school staff because it's, as I always like to say, budget is guesswork. We need to try to get as much of the guessing out of it as we can. And so hopefully, in our conversations, when you're going through this experiment, which by the way, I think you should do every year, where the superintendent and the school board propose a budget together. I'm just kidding. Sensitive topic, but that we try to make sure we're sharing information in real time. So next slide. And
Mr. Manager, we're glad you like it.
Yeah, I like it for them. But this, as everyone knows here, this is my favorite slide. This is actually a #2 Dixon Ticonderoga pencil with an eraser on the top this year. We added an eraser because my Boston accent came out there for a second. But you can see each of the little pieces of that pencil. And I just want to make sure for the new school board members, because I know you know this, but I want to emphasize it. The county, in our budget, we have $11 million of expenditures that go to assist schools in your functions, which we don't ask you to pay for. We've been around, it's not our side versus your side, but people should understand the services that are being provided, for example, on school nurses, where we've been able to get them in all middle schools now and high schools. That's just one example. Or what happens with crossing guards. There's a whole list here. Those are funded out of the county's bottom line. So that's not included in that 48.6%. And I think that's important to emphasize. And here's my favorite slide, the next one, which is, I'm done. Thank you.
So thank you, Mark. And I want to note that we have here our Department of Management and Finance leaders, Ms. Meredith, Mrs. Stevenson, and staff. Thank you. So they're working very, very, very hard. The county budget is about 1,000, how many? 1,009 pages?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 75,000 pages. No, it's 1,200 pages.
Yeah. Quality over quantity. So, Chair Calera.
Thank you. I will kick us off. Thank you for that overview of the county budget, in particular the ways that you zeroed in on the areas of overlap with the school operation. I appreciate that. When you talked about the uncertainty ahead, we spent time talking about the direct impact that loss of federal funding could have on the county budget. And you shared with us that there's only been one such known impact to date. The other impacts, of course, outside of direct federal funding are impact on the sort of general economic health of our community as people lose jobs or are under the threat of losing jobs. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit, I'm curious, and it's very early days, I'm curious whether you're seeing that place stress on tax revenues that are coming in for meals and other things, as people may need to tighten their budgets at home. The other thing that I'm curious, and they're two related questions, is as you track that over the course of the year, because it is early days, what's the process that you guys go through to, as you're tracking that, to understand when and how you would course correct if you're seeing that revenues are significantly off? And then the corollary to that, the part B, is because we have a revenue sharing agreement between schools and county, the sort of a baseline question for folks who are watching who may not be plugged into this is, what happens in a revenue sharing scenario when your revenues are lower? My assumption would be, as somebody viewing, that the share transfer to the schools then is correspondingly lower, and we would go through the same exercise of recalibrating. But if you can explain how that works for folks that are watching, that would be really helpful.
I'll start off with the tracking question, and I think I'm probably hand it off to the chair and other members of the board. So where we are, when we're preparing our budget and we propose it sort of around the third week of February, we have a very good sense of where we think real estate revenues are going to be. We are tracking our meals and sales and other kinds of taxes that are coming in. And there's about, I'm going to look over at Danielle, there's about a 2-month lapse, I think, 2-month lapse in real information. So sitting right here in March, we have really solid data through the end of December. We also have numbers for January. So talking about course corrections, I actually think it probably won't be until sometime in May, the end of May, that we'll have a solid sense of what the anarchy we have seen has caused and whether, in real terms, what the impact has been on some of those sensitive kinds of revenues. That's the first piece. And I don't know if you, on other pieces about sort of approaches to dealing with it, I know that the chair and members of the board have been working, trying to work with the state on this. And also, but, in my experience, when revenues have gone down, sure, that's something that has to be shared, but we're not quite there yet.
Just as a footnote, the kind of challenge that we have in front of us is quite uncharted, right? There are, naturally occurring economic phenomena take time. They evolve over time. They are responsive to countermeasures, et cetera, anti-cyclical work. This is not the case here, right? I just want to give you a number. I mean, if at any rate, it is going to be true that 75% of the federal workforce, and I'm not only talking about the federal workforce, is going to be laid off. This is equivalent of almost 9.75% unemployment rate tomorrow, just like that. But that's not the point. I think that the manager has wisely included a buffer fund that we call a stabilization fund. So definitely there is the first line of defense and less funds to absorb the shock. And it gives us enough time and space to recalibrate and come back and make tougher decisions. Not having to react, in an immediate way, but that doesn't mean that we can avoid having to react. So, Ms. Coffey.
I would just add, back to the General Assembly, they are able to convene a special session because they never adjourned their last special session, which is a fun parliamentarian trick. And the House and Senate have both set up special committees. The House will be up here in Northern Virginia in early April, I want to say. And I think, we're not alone. Arlington is not the only county that's facing this. And so there is going to be a large degree of regional and state cooperation in terms of how we all tackle this and approach this. But I think the biggest thing that I've been hearing is things are just changing every single day. And, folks who were illegally fired last week have been reemployed this week and maybe will be fired again. I think it's just a little too early to like know anything. But I think having the conversations and building the buffer in our reserve funding and trying to be as responsible and, not scare anyone preemptively, but be ready for as many worst case scenarios as we can. But it's going to include a lot of collaboration with our state and federal partners.
Mr. DeFranti.
Thank you. I think this is going to be the only comments I have in hopes, mindful that it's Friday afternoon. And I talked a lot earlier. So first off, to Ms. Coffey's point, the governor is running for Senate or president, and he is on March 24th going to amend the budget. But I think everybody knows here that the margins were so sufficient that if he tries to rupture the budget, he is going to risk being overridden. And so I think it is useful to try to get through March 24th as a point of uncertainty. That's to the state piece of it. To the chagrin certainly of some, but 88 million is the total federal threat, with Mr. Schwartz mentioned 33 million is where we get to if we do what we are near certain to do. But we had discussion of the real estate tax and rate, and the reason that I moved to advertise is to give us more time to try to narrow the uncertainty. The president's economic policy on tariffs are stupid, and everybody knows it. And the country's economy is showing it this week, and he's obsessed with the markets, and they're showing it this week. And so we may not get all that uncertainty done. But I would say that we'll get closer. I fully, as is in the superintendent's presentation, I fully anticipate not being at any real estate tax increase for myself, despite significant uncertainty still ahead of us. The chair has mentioned, it turns out if you tick off all of our neighbors, they don't want to come spend money on our hotels in Washington. And then there's the continuing resolution. But I wanted to mention that before I kind of ended with the thought about where we are. I said I still feel the net increase in your salaries after the discussion with Mr. Spain is 4.2%, I think, in the presentation. Our net is not the same and doesn't have to be precisely the same, but it's in the ballpark. And it is painful to me that sports figures get paid more than teachers, and will always be painful to me. But it is also the case we do have vacancies in our police, and so the markets are relevant to our police and fire. But there is a rough equivalency of investment there that through your restraint, and mindful that our educators would have wanted much more, 5.5%. For me, I've just started to get the emails on the meals tax. And I am mindful of our small businesses, but I don't believe that most people choose whether to go out in Falls Church or Alexandria or Arlington based on 4% versus 5%. And I do believe we have to invest in our schools, so I fully anticipate that being part of it. It is painful, it does impact lower income folks, but it is still a choice to go out, and we must support our restaurants as small businesses. But that is an indication of your seriousness trying to be met by, I think, all of us, but certainly me on this board, saying we need to work together to meet the structural challenge. And the meals tax is something I anticipate supporting, which is, we've gotten the emails and mindful of those restaurants, but I do feel as though that's a way that I hope we're showing that we're in this with you. We're fighting with you, and we're fighting against foolish and inhumane policies that are humanly created. And that's not the same as COVID, but we got to dig in and fight, because we all may be impacted, but Arlington, perhaps more than any other place in Northern Virginia, is at risk because of the 24,000 federal employees and the federal contractors who are going to make our economy, going to be facing economic challenges that we have to be responsible about.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrand. Mr. Spain, then Ms. Conley.
Well, I'll keep it brief, and I will align. I'm really glad that align with my colleague, Ms. Coffey, and her comments. There's just so much that is going on. I've heard the word uncertainty probably used 1,000 times in the past couple of weeks. That is just, we don't want that to get normalized. But let me just tell you where I stand when it comes from a budgetary aspect and what we're looking at least what I'm looking at, because you're doing your part, we're doing our part. You talked earlier in the presentation that the budget reflects your values, and I think we here on the county board are somewhat of the same. The vice chair talked a little bit about rationale behind tax rate and why he voted, and I'll share a little bit about where I'm thinking. I learned something a long time ago that we prepare for war in a time of peace, but I also understand from 52 years of being on this earth, there's a lot of folks in this community of 240,000 people that aren't as influent as you may think they are. They are suffering. And a lot of times they aren't heard. And I think at the end of the day, when we think about economic growth and a prosperous society, and we're one Arlington, I'll tell you why I'm not waver. That is getting behind our schools and making sure our students and our teachers are well taken care of. All right? So if I can leave you with anything, I'm going to work with my colleagues to make sure if we have to come back with the county manager in a few months and look at something again because we just don't hit that point of what we expect, trust and believe we're going to keep schools in mind, I believe, in our students. So you have that commitment for me as one leader of 5, and I'm assuming you'll get some level of support, if not more, from my colleagues as well. So those are my comments.
I'll keep it brief as well. I just wanted to lift up the issues that are not just economic, but that the economic disruption and the immigration and refugee disruption and the uncertainty overall is weighing heavy on many in our community. And you have the largest workforce. You also have the daily, hourly, real touches with some of our most vulnerable in the community. And so through this time, really, in addition to the planning and the strategic plan and getting it perfect for the long term, please, send us the signals day to day, because we know there will be needs, and we can guess some of them, but we're going to have to be adjusting on the fly, and we are all up for that, and we want to respond to our community's needs as they evolve.
Thank you, everybody.
I actually have a question that follows right from that. It's like a formula, and then in the middle there's a story, and then eventually I get to a question. That's how it works. That's right, yeah. Okay, so I think we all share a priority around our schools being successful, academic success, high level of outcomes for students, and ideally low achievement gaps, right? So this is, I think, a shared value and goal. Spoken with all of you, I believe that is a shared value and goal. I think, we have a challenge in terms of those outcomes with our economically disadvantaged students, our students with disabilities, our English learners, et cetera. One of those solutions that we are currently working on is around chronic absenteeism, right? We need to reduce absenteeism because that is one of the drivers of a lack of success and a lack of achievement. And so here comes the story, which is that I met a couple of weeks ago with one of our elementary school principals, Title I school, and that principal has, since the start of the year, 40 students who fall under the category of chronically absent, which means they have missed more than 10% of the school year. So we have 180 days in a school year. That means once you go above 18 days, you are considered chronically absent, and this was at the midpoint of the year. So 40 students in that category. This principal was meeting one-on-one, face-to-face with each parent or guardian or set of parents to uncover what's going on. What are the barriers here to your student coming to school? And many things have come out. Things like a single mom who has not been able to get a job in Arlington and took a job in Leesburg and leaves at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive to Leesburg, therefore is not at home to get her children up and out the door, has to rely on neighbors and family and babysitter and, this, that, and the other, and it's not working. So when I look at the services and programs reduction slide, or just generally, are there things that we should be concerned about? Because the solutions in most of these cases are not things that the school system is going to solve. It is the services that the family needs. In very few instances, in fact, is it that the kid doesn't, well, in the high school, maybe they don't like coming to school, but at the elementary school level, I would argue they want to be there. They get breakfast there, they get lunch there, they get recess time, they get, So what should we be concerned about in terms of services that may, either in your current budget proposal, have an impact there, or that you envision might be a struggle down the road?
Well, let me start, and then I'll turn it over to the board. We have made no cuts, and as a matter of fact, we've had selected increases in things that deal with behavioral health care or have to do with food. And when there's still some unallocated funds, we may be taking a look at adding some more there. The kinds of things that focus on the daily necessities and also increasing housing grants funds to make sure that people can stay where they're at. We made a lot of those changes. I think, at least in what I proposed, we've been consistent in making sure that that safety net is strong. And I think it's with the board right now for them to comment additionally. But I think those individual students that you're talking about, there's all, in certain circumstances, we've given additional child care funds, we've done things. There's only so much we can do as a government. So, I feel comfortable, at least what I put on the table, but I'm going to since the budget is with the board now, I'll let them add or subtract.
Ms. Khan.
I would just support that as well. I think we sent the manager off with a request to keep in mind our most vulnerable, and we will stay true to that. I think the thing to be most worried about, and that I am increasingly worried about, is the federal, the local government can't do everything that the federal government's supposed to be doing unless we do a major change to how taxes are collected. So, I think the biggest shocks are around housing programs if they were to evaporate. You guys know they're around school lunch programs if that were to evaporate, Medicaid eligibility. And then I think the more kind of the ambient fear and uncertainty like we talked about before, and just how that comes out sideways in the community.
Mr. Director to front and then Mr. Spain.
Okay, great.
It's a sentence. On eviction prevention, there's some detail that shows our fiscal restraint while staying true to the safety net. So if you get a question about eviction prevention, come talk to one of us, because there is some detail that you need to know. I just don't want you to be surprised.
Mr. Spain.
Oh, I'll just brief. You brought up, Vice Chair, you brought up a great, I think a large conversation, even outside of what we're doing in our budget line with some of our services in DHS, that's going to get in front of making sure our students and there's programs in place for families so they won't be absent. But I think what we have not discussed, and this is why I got a little sarcastic earlier about we can be here all night, I think there's a number of societal ills taking place right now that are tied to folks not attending school. And we haven't had that conversation. There's fear in our community. So I would be wondering to know, what are you hearing when it comes to some of our minority populations about fear attending school, given the national issue? Just want to hear your thoughts on that. And I know the Vice Chair is very in tune on hunger and homelessness. But I'm also worried with the lack of federal funding. How many of these students, right, are coming to school hungry? If these grants fail, and how are we reaching them and how we're identifying them, and even when we come up on spring break and summertime, how we know our youth are getting the basic necessities, meals to survive. So first, absenteeism, and I think you know where I'm going with the threat. ICE, perhaps, families don't want to send their kids to school. That's real.
Thank you,
You know,
Mr. Spain.
I think they're getting ready to.
Any response to that?
I was asking a question of my colleague related to what you were saying, and I wonder if Dr. Duran could talk about it, and it relates to our free and reduced price meal program. And where my brain went as you were talking was someone who didn't think they needed free and reduced price meal assistance in August when school starts may realize by March or April that that's a necessity. And so my wondering, because I am not intimately familiar with this program, is the frequency with which someone can raise their hand to say, I need this help.
People can submit application, and then it can be verified, their change of income. We also have some community, I forgot the CEP, what is this? Community eligibility, I would call it CEP. If I said that, I want the public, what is that? Community eligibility programs. We have several schools that we have identified where all students who attend there get free and reduced lunch as well. In terms of the chronic absenteeism, we are monitoring that. We have actually seen a couple of days of dips where there has been media out there where there is individuals in the community, but we've also seen some positive outcomes with regard to the work that the board has done, some policies that they've passed, the efforts that we've been putting out in the community to share that school is one of the safest places to be. So we actually have seen not as much as we thought we would in terms of students staying home from school, but we do notice that on certain days when there are media and things of that nature, some dips in some schools, and that's when our school teams are reaching out to those families, our bilingual family specialists. We have developed a resource page. We've developed opportunities. All of our teachers and our staff have gotten some level of just training in terms of ICE, not so much that, but our student support teams have gotten a lot of training. Our counselors, our psychologists, social workers, that type, they've gotten training on some ways to reach out to families. And so we've done some protection about what to do. Our security vegetables having been in place, that's very helpful. I'll defer to the school board. I want to talk about the policy they've passed, but we are looking at it week by week, day by day, even in some cases.
And I want to add on, so two quick pieces on when Wakefield High School, for example, moved to being a community eligible school, the percentage of students who were taking breakfasts and lunches at school went way up. So removing the barrier of having to fill out the paperwork and the student knowing that it was no cost made a big difference. And so I know we're not in an environment right now where we're going to expect to see universally free meals, but it makes a big difference. I would say also, Mr. Spain, one of my concerns over the past couple of weeks has been the conflation of seeing an Arlington County police car and assuming that it is federal law enforcement of some sort. And I think that we all have more work to do to communicate that the presence of an Arlington County police car has nothing to do, or very little, or likely nothing to do with immigration enforcement.
Nothing.
Nothing. So I understand on the fact sheet that there is the condition that they will be protecting public safety. So they may be in the vicinity of an ICE raid if there is a public safety matter that the police need to. But I think that we need to be doing much more in the community right now to assuring people that the presence of a police car, I mean, it literally was on my neighborhood listserv. Somebody said, there's a police car on 13th Street. Do you think this is? And it was like, no. And there's a wonderful fact sheet that that the police department has that says,
Yeah, I saw it.
this is what we do, this is what we won't do. That should be everywhere. It should be posted in all our schools. It should be everywhere. I've personally sent it to school principals to say, give this out, because I think some of the fear, like we have some control over with, information sharing that we could potentially make a difference.
Yeah, and appreciate that. I think and glad to know that you're tracking, I would assume, those families that, one, chronic absenteeism has been perhaps a trend over many months, even prior to what's the latest and greatest, but that you're also, Ms. Hadley, I know we've had a lot of conversations about this, to a segment of our community tracking, right, to make sure who are these individuals that have this fear, right, and articulating a great message And I want to commend you, superintendent and team, for what you're doing out to the community, more especially those vulnerable populations that, hey, just because you see a car, that's not ICE. Because we're getting it on this end as well, right, from county board. So thank you for your leadership. And I guess my thought was that chronic absenteeism there's a lot of different layers that feed into that, right, from a societal aspect.
Right, and we all, I think, share concerns in that regard, and in fact, it's kind of a constant dialogue that we have, and are grateful for the staff who are constantly sort of peppered with questions from us and are very responsive. I just wanted to give a few very specific points, Mr. Spain, on the question of fear that you raised, and give, again, thanks to our chair and to our vice chair for their work in really helping us advance some specific deliverables that I have seen make a difference. So number one specifically, and the superintendent as well, from back in January when the superintendent issued a statement clarifying how our schools are safe spaces. That was, I think, the beginning of a really wonderful process where we were seeing, and I was hearing from community members, particularly in the Latino community, a lot of concern and a lot of fear and panic, actually panic, justifiably so, right? Because we were in the uncertainty. We didn't know what enforcement would look like, where it would happen, what it would be. So it started with the superintendent's leadership and that statement, and then followed quickly by a safe schools resolution process led by the chair, a specific policy on how to implement the safe schools resolution by our policy chair and school board vice chair. So these things, and we have been out there explaining this to the community. So just as recently, I've gone to 2 different sessions at WNL, informing, again, especially Spanish-speaking parents who aren't always getting all of our messages, right, and may not have attended the school board meeting where we passed this resolution. So highlighting for them in WhatsApp chat threads, a lot of our parent volunteers, and I'll give also kudos to ASHPA, the Association of Hispanic Parents in our schools, who have been very quick to get out the message of these specific actions we're taking. Also, out of input from the community, we begin to enact additional measures. For example, we got the input that it would be really nice to have your one-pager of how you're keeping schools and law enforcement out of school safe in welcoming areas, right, in the reception areas. So the team and superintendent staff moved on that. So now we have these, my understanding is that now they are up, these messages and posts, papers in reception areas highlighting that our schools are safe. And I also want to thank some county employees, Corporal Mendoza specifically from Arlington Police. He's been doing the rounds. I've been with him at a number of these events where he has very specifically clarified the role of police. And I even learned, right, like there was a stop at a bus stop where someone, I think there was a victim of a crime, called police, and he was explaining, look, you too may be victim of a crime, and if you call us, we're going to come, and that it's standard procedure, right? How many police may show up, and so to not be afraid, essentially, if you see like more than one show up. So these little things really go a long way to informing community. And finally, where I do see some ongoing sort of concern is in the part of, and again, we're dealing with this is in the transit for in the sense of parents and kids, in the transit from home to school. Again, I think the community in Arlington, and I'm so grateful we live here, has really stepped up. This is one example where neighbors are walking each other's kids to the bus stop, right? Or walking, or just are afraid to ride the bus, and so they will walk to school. Again, not great, not ideal that we are living under the circumstances, but the community stepping up. And finally, also to inform the community to the point of reducing the fear. A number of local organizations, nonprofits, and I'm sure you all know well, they're all doing Know Your Rights forums. The schools have stepped up to do, many PTAs have been doing their own Know Your Rights forums for families in our schools. So, and community members who are immigration lawyers are giving, workshops at the schools that I've been to. So these are all actions that I think the community is also taking that I have seen really make a difference in terms of the panic. Now, absenteeism, again, as I think my colleagues mentioned, may be due to a number of factors, but I'm glad to say that I think immigration enforcement is now less of a factor.
Thank you.
Yes, I saw Ms. Coffey's lighting.
Yeah, sorry, you were talking about, concerns about any of these cuts in our programming and how those wraparound services relate to the needs of your families beyond just the school building. And I think kind of similar to, the side of yours that highlighted, the $50 million worth of things you would do absent the current funding pressures. I don't think that we're in a position where we've cut anything that's going to create additional risk or problems, but it's the things that we're not adding that we, probably would like to add. A lot of what it comes down to with reaching those really, vulnerable people who are struggling, people whose kids aren't showing up to school, right, is you can't go through the same normal channels because the engaged parents are the ones who are responding to you. The people who don't have extra stressors in their lives, they're easy to reach. And so it comes down to casework and having people with capacity to do the work. And I would love to, be able to add more social workers and behavioral health staff and caseworkers that can address some of those wraparound problems. I think we all know that our human services staff does a remarkable amount with such little resources, and their caseloads are high, and they keep working through it. But I think it's more that than that we don't have things we've had previously. It's, going that extra mile is a bit harder when you can't add that extra person.
Thank you, Ms. Coffey. The fear is real. The fear is absolutely paralyzing and it's only because of the community's collective response that there is this resiliency there. No matter what else we do, if the community is not with us, we are not going to succeed. The fact that we are succeeding to at least absorb some of that and not have dramatically drops in school attendance, etc., is uniquely, the credit is all with our community. And by the way, with the brave immigrant community who's taking these risks today. Because fear is one part. Having the absolute guts to take the risks with your kids is heroic, epic. That said, there is another thing. I think, and to what Ms. Cunningham and Ms. Coffey have mentioned, job precariousness, the rug being pulled under your feet, and every sense of the way, etc., is creating rifts and imbalances that we haven't gotten even closely to evaluate right now. And I'm very concerned about that. So yes, we are not going to, it's absolutely not even contemplated to reduce the services there. However, I'm very much afraid that the demand will skyrocket, and our ability to, and we will have to choose what is more important, less important, etc., and what parts of the wraparound services we need to defend the first line and then second line. That is an upcoming conversation we have.
Thank you. I actually have two other budget questions. One is very quick and simple, so let me do that one first. And that is just, have you talked about, is there a concern that that you've increased Parks and Rec fees, and in fact, may there be a lower demand, example, for summer camps because people are not going to work? So has there been, are you having some conversation about sort of that trade-off?
So yes, we obviously can't control for demand. Right now, we've gotten some questions from the board, and we'll be coming back with some ideas around situations where people got online whenever the crazy dates were, and they, signed up all their kids for camp, and it was a household where there were 2 federal employees, and they were so excited they're going to send all their kids off to camp, and now they don't have jobs. What do we do about that? So we'll come back. We're working through some options there that I think we'll have to share with the board, but we're thinking about it.
Yeah,
And we don't have a lot of time, so we're thinking.
Thank you. And then I also just, as I was looking through your budget presentation, some of the things online, I just would like to better understand the different housing programs that you have, how they are being funded, and what is the level of funding relative to, past years, for example.
All right, so we actually have a relatively short summary in the front part of our budget that talks about our overall housing programs in excess of $100 million. The main point for this conversation would be that we have a housing grant program, and someone's going to tell me the amount of money. Yeah, and we have a housing choice voucher program. But yeah, the housing choice voucher program, which is a little bit bigger than our housing grant program, is all federal funds. And then, we have an affordable housing investment fund, which goes into more of the bricks and mortar of projects coming down. That right now, when I'm proposing a little bit less than what was in there before, but we get repayments from developers. My main focus actually has been on making sure that our housing grant program is sustainable with ongoing funds. And the demand continues to go up. That's making sure people who are at most 80% of area median income, many cases less, have smaller salaries and don't get that high up on the AMI scale, are able to step in and use our committed affordable units and other units in the county. That's been a very high stress program, but we're proposing increases in that.
And I'll just add that work session is online, and there's a great presentation that goes through all the numbers, but it's, roughly 1,800 households in the housing choice voucher program. That's both seniors and disabled and families. And then it's about 14, no, sorry, it's higher than that. There's about 1,400 that are in, 1,600 that are in our committed affordable. Anyway, you can go through it. I won't try to pull them out, but they're roughly the same number.
The rough philosophy here is the programs that keep people in their homes right now, allow them, make it possible for them to be able to afford their rents, etc. These programs are intact. There is one change that is proposed right now on the eviction prevention program, which is about hardships, and the proposed cut is only applying to those who have a lease that is less than 6 months old, right? Those who have been and have, for a while in their unit and they have experienced a hardship, et cetera, we're going to jump in. Plus, this is also a program that has a discretionary part, so the case managers can overrule the general rules of the program and jump in. AHEF is an investment tool in longer term, but for the programs that respond to any housing impact from what happens in general in our market, we are in one of the worst housing markets almost in a generation. These programs are intact and they are growing, which is also fiscal pressure. Housing, and we are the only jurisdictions who actually has them. I mean, just making sure that this is clear.
Along the lines of services that folks may need, and this isn't really a question, just an exercise in mindfulness of some of the needs. A friend of mine posted a picture of her husband repairing a wheelchair for her student because Medicaid denied the claim. And so, I mean, it's hard to speculate what could happen, and I don't want to go down that path because any number of things could happen with Medicaid and cuts and so forth. I think as we're going down this path and thinking through some of these things that could happen, I just want us to be mindful of the fact that this is going to, cuts and changes to Medicaid could impact different populations of the population very differently. And so as we're going along this, if we hear of needs, I definitely think we should be in partnership, particularly around the space of, the durable medical equipment, especially if people need help and support traveling to and from work if they're getting their claims denied, school, whatever the case may be. We may need to take some partnership and a different approach to that to make sure. That's not really under the purview of schools. It's not really necessarily under the purview of the county, but definitely something that our community would need. And the other thing would be the mental health services, because different than COVID where there was isolation, this is an absurd amount of pressure for families and community members to be under. And I recognize that with that amount of pressure, and we talked a little bit about this with after-school activities and trying to fill that, we don't want community members, children, or parents looking for self-medicating to get through this really tough, hard time. So, I hope that we can continue conversations in those areas to make sure that we are addressing those populations or needs as they come up.
I fully agree with you. By the way, just anecdotally, the one most sought-after flyer on our table last week in the Federal Employees and Contractors Fair was about how to deal with stress. The questions were staggered in normal things, jobs, health insurance, etc. But the most sought-after flyer, the stack of flyers that we ran out of was about that. So, colleagues, Ms. Cunningham was Mr. Joe. Okay. Questions? Any other? We could. So, before I thank everybody, I just want to recognize Mary Kadira for having this meeting here. And we recognize that it's apparently, we are not going to have another one of this type, exactly this work session. We will continue to work. We really appreciate your service. This has been a absolutely super pressurized year, and we think that I believe I'm speaking for everybody here to thank you profusely for your dedication to public service.
Amen.
So, and with that, thanking everybody else as well, our superintendent, county manager, the staff that's behind all that, who's working, and the many members of the community that are assisting and are paying attention so that we are on track and we are addressing the issues and the questions of everybody in an effective and helpful way. So, and with that, we are adjourned. You can pull this.